Hey there, night owls. Tonight we're cracking open the story of the strongest man who ever lived. And trust me, your school textbook left out all the good parts. Ancient Greece is a mess. Monsters everywhere, titans throwing tantrums, and humans basically running for their lives between breakfast and dinner. So Zeus, king of the gods, decides it's time to build a hero. He picks a mortal princess named Alcmene, and soon a boy named Hercules is born, strong enough to save the world. One tiny problem. Hera, Zeus's wife, finds out about her husband's latest mortal romance, and she is not amused. From day one, she swears this kid will suffer for every single breath he takes. Welcome to the most cursed childhood in mythology. Before we dive in, hit that like button and drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from tonight. Now dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's roll. Up on Olympus, the queen of the gods looks down at the woman carrying her husband's child, and she begins to plan. Killing the boy outright is off the table. Zeus would never allow it, and the other gods would notice. But Hera has spotted something better. A few months earlier, in front of the entire Olympian council, Zeus made a careless boast. The next descendant of Perseus born on a particular day, he declared, would rule the mighty kingdom of Mycenae. It was meant as a coronation gift for his unborn son. It turns out to be exactly the kind of promise Zeus should not have made out loud. Because Hercules is not the only descendant of Perseus about to enter the world. In a smaller palace down in Argos, a woman named Nisipe is also pregnant 7 months along, with a boy who will be called Eurystheus. Hera sees the loophole the way a hungry wolf spots a limping deer. She descends to earth, calls in a favour from the goddess of childbirth, a minor deity named Eileithyia, and sets her plan in motion. Eileithyia sits down outside Alcmene's bedroom door, laces her fingers together tightly and begins to wait. In the ancient world, crossed fingers were believed to magically block a birth from proceeding. It is, frankly, one of the strangest forms of divine sabotage ever recorded, the most powerful goddess in the cosmos pulling off her scheme by essentially making a hand pretzel and refusing to let go. For nearly 7 full days, Alcmene struggles in agony while the gods on Olympus place quiet bets on the outcome. Some side with Zeus, some side with Hera, and a few simply pour themselves more nectar and pretend not to be invested in the drama unfolding below. Eventually, a clever servant in Alcmene's household figures out what is happening. She bursts out of the bedroom door, claps her hands, and shouts that the baby has already been born. Eileithyia, startled, accidentally unlaces her fingers in shock. The spell breaks instantly, and Alcmene finally gives birth to her son, along with a twin half-brother named Iphicles, fathered the very same night by her mortal husband Amphitryon. It is, you have to admit, a very unusual family situation. Most households do not produce 2 siblings with 2 different fathers in a single evening, one of whom happens to be a god. But this is mythology, where weekend gatherings tended to get complicated. By the time the sun sets that day, Eurystheus has entered the world first, technically fulfilling Zeus's oath. The kingdom that should have belonged to Heracles, the throne that was promised to the greatest hero ever born, now belongs to a sickly, frightened, frail little baby, who, unsurprisingly, will grow up into a sickly, frightened, frail little man. Zeus realizes what has happened the moment he glances down from Olympus. He sees Eurystheus wailing in his cradle, already the future king of Mycenae, while his own divine son is still waiting to be born. The king of the gods is furious, but he's also bound by his own promise. You can't be the supreme ruler of the universe and then weasel out of your sacred oaths just because your wife outsmarted you. Well, you can, but the other gods would never let you hear the end of it. So Zeus does what Zeus does best in moments of marital crisis, which is to come up with a slightly petty scheme of his own. He plots a way to give Heracles at least a piece of the divine power Hera tried to steal from him. The plan is gloriously ridiculous. Zeus orders the messenger god Hermes to sneak baby Heracles up to Olympus while Hera is taking her afternoon nap. Picture this for a moment. The mightiest goddess in the cosmos, the protector of marriage and queen of heaven, snoring peacefully on her cloud throne while the king of the gods is essentially organizing a milk heist against his own wife. Hermes carries the infant carefully across the sky, tiptoeing the way only an immortal can tiptoe, and gently places him at Hera's breast. The baby, who has the appetite you would expect from a future demigod, latches on and drinks deeply. The divine milk floods through his tiny body, filling his cells with a fraction of the immortal strength of the gods themselves. It's the kind of nutritional boost that would put every modern energy drink to shame. But here's where things go beautifully sideways. Heracles drinks so vigorously that he bites down on Hera's chest, and the goddess jolts awake with the universe's most divine yelp. She shoves the baby away, and the sacred milk sprays across the heavens in a long glowing arc. That arc, the one we still squint at from our backyards on clear summer nights, becomes the Milky Way. Every twinkling band of stars stretched across the cosmos is essentially a permanent reminder of the moment Hera realized her husband had pulled the most petty parenting stunt in mythological history. The Greeks even named our galaxy after this story, which is why the word galaxy itself comes from the ancient Greek word for milk. You can think about that the next time you eat a granola bar. For Hera, though, the milk in the sky is more than just a celestial inconvenience. It's a wound she will never let heal. Every single night she looks up and sees the evidence of Zeus's betrayal smeared across the heavens. Every constellation reminds her that her husband cheated on her, and then literally fed their love child from her own divine body without her permission. Imagine your worst possible marital argument, multiply it by infinity, and then carve it into the night sky. That is roughly how Hera feels every time the stars come out. From that moment on, her hatred for Heracles isn't just personal, it is cosmic, woven into the fabric of reality itself. Meanwhile, baby Heracles grows at an alarming rate. He's barely a year old when Hera tries her first direct attempt on his life. She sends 2 enormous serpents slithering into the nursery expecting them to handle her little problem before bedtime. What she didn't account for was the fact that the milk had done its job rather thoroughly. Heracles, still wearing the ancient Greek equivalent of footy pyjamas, sees the snakes coming and decides they look like very interesting toys. By the time his terrified mother bursts into the room, expecting to find a tragedy, she finds her son laughing in his crib with a strangled serpent in each chubby fist. The poor snakes never stood a chance. It was, quite possibly, the most one-sided fight in mythology. Even his stepfather Amphitryon, who walks in moments later, can only stand there blinking at the scene in front of him. It is the moment everyone in the household realizes this kid is not exactly going to be the gentle, quiet type. Iphicles, the mortal twin, reacts in a much more ordinary way. He wails at the top of his tiny lungs, which is, frankly, the correct response when you wake up next to 2 giant snakes in your nursery. The contrast between the 2 boys could not be more obvious. One is screaming for his mother and trying to climb the cradle railing in terror. The other is gurgling with delight, gnawing happily on a scaly tail like it is a particularly fun teething ring. From this moment on, no one in the household ever doubts which of the twins got the divine paternity. Iphicles will grow up to be a perfectly fine young man, a decent warrior in his own right, and a loyal companion to his brother. But he will never quite escape the family story of how he cried while his sibling redecorated the nursery with serpent corpses. Word of the incident spreads quickly. People in Thebes start whispering about the child of Alcmene who killed 2 divine serpents before he could speak in full sentences. The seer Tiresias is summoned, and he predicts a future filled with glory, monsters, and a great deal of suffering. He doesn't elaborate too much on the suffering part, possibly because he doesn't want to ruin the mood at a baby shower. Alcmene listens carefully and tries to convince herself that the glory will outweigh the pain. It is, sadly, the kind of optimism that only works on paper. As Heracles grows, his strength grows with him in ways that make ordinary tasks deeply problematic. He breaks his lyre over his music teacher's head, which understandably ends his musical career. He cannot play sports without accidentally turning every game into an emergency room visit. His parents eventually send him out to the countryside to live with shepherds, mostly because the city of Thebes can't afford to keep replacing furniture, doors, and the occasional unlucky tutor. Out among the herds, the boy finally finds a place where his strength is useful. He hunts wild beasts, protects the flocks, and learns to channel his power into something other than property damage. His teachers along the way are some of the most legendary names in Greek myth, which makes sense given that no ordinary tutor could survive him for long. The great king of Sparta, Castor, teaches him how to fight with sword and shield. A famous archer named Eurytus teaches him how to use a bow, although Eurytus would later regret this decision when his student became significantly better at archery than the master himself. Wrestling lessons come from a man named Autolycus, who also happens to be one of the greatest thieves in mythology, although those lessons probably did not stick the way the wrestling did. And music, which had not gone well with the lyre incident, is eventually entrusted to a kinder teacher named Linus. Unfortunately, Linus also dies after correcting Heracles a bit too sharply during a lesson, an incident that the young student insists was accidental. The court of Thebes, having now lost 2 music teachers in a single childhood, gently suggests that perhaps a career in the arts is not in the cards. Heracles, who never cared much for music anyway, agrees with surprising enthusiasm. It's during these years in the wilderness that Heracles first encounters the great philosophical question of his life. According to legend, he sits down at a crossroads one afternoon, exhausted from a hunt, when 2 divine women appear before him. One is dressed in finery and offers him a life of pleasure, comfort and ease. She promises wine, feasts, beautiful companions, and a complete absence of difficulty. The other woman is plainly dressed, with calloused hands and an honest face. She offers him only sweat, struggle, and the chance to do something meaningful with his life. She does not sugarcoat what she's selling. She is, essentially, the worst recruitment pitch in history, and yet Heracles, after a long moment of thought, takes her hand. He chooses the path of virtue over the path of comfort, which is something the gods make a note of for later. They are, as it turns out, taking notes constantly. Years pass, and Heracles grows into a young man with shoulders the width of doorways and a beard that arrives early because his face cannot wait to look heroic. He becomes a renowned warrior in Thebes, defending the city from neighbouring tribes, putting down rebellions, and accidentally inventing several new forms of wrestling along the way. His most famous early victory comes against a tyrant named Erginus, the king of a nearby city who has been forcing Thebes to pay an outrageous yearly tribute. Heracles, who is by now perhaps 18 years old, decides that this arrangement is unfair. He gathers a small band of young men, ambushes the tribute collectors on a forest road, and sends them home in such poor condition that Erginus declares war within the week. The war does not last long. Heracles personally leads the charge, defeats Erginus in single combat, and turns the tables so completely that the conquered city ends up paying double the tribute to Thebes from that day forward. The Thebans naturally throw a parade. The king of Thebes, a man named Creon, is so impressed by Heracles that he offers him the hand of his daughter, Megara. It is meant as a reward, the highest honour the city can give. Heracles, who has never had time for romance between killing lions and chasing bandits, takes one look at Megara and decides that maybe, just maybe, there is room in his life for something other than warfare. What follows is a brief and surprisingly tender period. The fiercest warrior in Greece becomes, of all things, a devoted husband. He builds Megara a beautiful home with his own enormous hands, which is a small miracle considering he can barely hold a hammer without flattening it. They have children together, a small handful of bright-eyed boys who chase each other around the courtyard and look up at their father like he's a mountain that occasionally tells bedtime stories. For a brief, shining moment, Heracles is happy. He's not a hero in this part of his life. He is a husband, a father, a man who has found a corner of the world where being the strongest mortal alive actually feels like a blessing rather than a curse. In the mornings, he takes his sons out to the olive groves to teach them how to climb trees and identify the calls of different birds. The boys, who have inherited a fraction of their father's strength, can already lift things that no ordinary child their age should be able to lift, which leads to many anxious afternoons in which Megara has to convince her 3-year-old to please put the goat down before he hurts it. In the evenings, the family gathers around a small fire while Heracles tells them stories about the world beyond the walls of Thebes. He tells them about distant mountains, about strange beasts, about the gods who live above the clouds. He does not tell them, of course, that one of those gods is his father. He's not entirely sure how to explain that part. Some questions are easier to leave for later. Megara, for her part, is no shy princess. She had been raised in a royal household, trained to speak her mind, and she does not let her husband's celebrity get in the way of a healthy domestic argument. When Heracles tracks mud across her clean floors after a day of hunting, she scolds him with the same energy she would use on one of her sons. When he forgets to return home in time for dinner because he was busy chasing a wild boar across 3 hills, she lets him know about it. And when he tries to apologize with grand romantic gestures, like uprooting an entire flowering tree from the wilderness and carrying it home as a gift, she sighs at him fondly and asks where exactly he plans to put a flowering tree inside their already crowded courtyard. Their marriage is, by all accounts, an ordinary one in all the ways that matter. It is the kind of ordinary that, in a heroic life like his, ends up being the most extraordinary thing of all. It lasts about as long as you would expect for a mythological hero whose mother-in-law is the queen of the gods. Up on Olympus, Hera looks down at this scene of domestic bliss and feels something inside her chest twist into a knot. She has spent years watching this man flourish despite all her efforts to ruin him. She has sent serpents, plagues, accidents, and bad luck, and yet here he is, content, surrounded by people who love him. For Hera, this is unacceptable. Hatred, when it is divine, does not allow for the possibility of happiness in its target, so she reaches for the cruelest weapon in her arsenal, one she's been saving for just this moment. She sends madness. Now, the way the ancient Greeks understood madness is a little different from how we think about it today. To them, it wasn't a medical condition or a chemical imbalance. It was a curse, something that descended from the gods like a storm cloud and swallowed a person's mind whole. When Hera unleashes her madness on Hercules, it is not a gentle confusion. It is a complete severing of his perception from reality. The world he sees with his own eyes becomes a hallucination, painted by the goddess to maximize the damage she can do. In his mind, Heracles is no longer standing in his own home. He believes he's in the middle of a great battle, surrounded by enemies who have invaded his city. His family, the wife and children he adores, are transformed in his vision into hideous creatures sent to destroy him. He sees fanged beasts, armored warriors, monsters reaching out to tear apart everything he loves. And the great hero, the man whose only purpose in life has always been to protect, does what any warrior would do. He fights back. By the time the madness lifts and Heracles blinks the haze from his eyes, the silence in his home is the kind of silence that no man ever recovers from. His family is gone. His wife and his sons, the people he built his entire world around, are lost to him forever. The hands that had been so strong, so useful, so good at making toys for his children and pulling his wife close at night, those same hands have done something they can never undo. He drops to his knees in the middle of his own ruined house, and for the first time in his life, the strongest man alive understands what it means to be utterly broken. He sits there for hours, motionless. Neighbours hear the silence and come running, only to back away in horror when they understand what has happened. No one approaches him. No one speaks. The hero of Thebes, the defender of the city, the man they all loved and admired, has become something they cannot look at. He himself does not know what he has become. He only knows that the world has ended, and he is somehow still alive inside the wreckage. When his stepfather Amphitryon finally arrives, the old man sees his son and weeps in a way old men weep only when something has gone permanently wrong. He gently takes Heracles by the arm and leads him out of the house. He does not try to explain what happened. He does not try to comfort him. There is no comfort for this. He simply walks beside him through the streets of Thebes, while the people of the city press their backs against the walls to let them pass, too afraid to even look up. Heracles tries to take his own life. He is not gentle about it. He is, after all, the strongest man in the world, and he believes he deserves to feel the weight of what he has done. But his friends and family stop him, again and again, until eventually they convince him to seek out the one being who might be able to tell him what to do, the oracle at Delphi. The journey to Delphi alone takes him several days, and during those days, Heracles barely eats or sleeps. He walks through forests without noticing the trees, crosses streams without noticing the water, and ignores travellers who recognise him on the road. Word of what has happened has spread faster than he could possibly outrun it. In every village he passes, people stop what they are doing and stare. Some make signs against evil. Others, more compassionate, leave small offerings of bread and water along his path, the way one might leave food out for a wounded animal that no one has the courage to approach directly. Heracles does not touch the offerings. He is not entirely certain he deserves them. He keeps walking. By the time he reaches the temple at Delphi, perched on the slopes of Mount Parnassus, his sandals are worn through, and his eyes have the hollow look of a man who has not been entirely present inside his own body for some time. The priests at the temple recognize him at once. They do not ask why he has come. They simply lead him into the inner sanctuary where the Pythia, the priestess of Apollo, awaits. The oracle is the most sacred religious site in all of ancient Greece. A priestess called the Pythia sits over a deep chasm in the temple of Apollo, inhaling vapours that rise from the earth, and through her, the god Apollo himself speaks. Or at least, that is what is supposed to happen. In practice, The Pythia's prophecies are often so vague that you could interpret them as a recipe for stew if you squinted hard enough. But for Heracles, the prophecy that day is unusually direct. The oracle tells him that he must journey to the kingdom of Mycenae and offer himself in service to King Eurystheus for 10 years. He must perform whatever labours the king demands of him, no matter how dangerous, no matter how impossible. Only then can he hope to cleanse himself of his terrible sorrow and earn, perhaps, a kind of peace. What Heracles does not know, because the oracle does not bother to mention this part, is that the entire prophecy has been written by Hera. The goddess has been whispering into the dreams of the Pythia for nights on end, planting the words she wants the hero to hear. Eurystheus, the cousin who stole his kingdom at birth, is now the man Heracles must serve. The frail, frightened king who has spent his entire life knowing that he sits on a throne that should have belonged to his far more impressive relative will now be the master of that very relative. The injustice of it is almost poetic. Heracles hears the prophecy and bows his head. He has no fight left in him. He is, in this moment, not the lion-strangling child, or the wrestler of bandits, or the killer of monsters. He's a man so broken that he will accept any punishment, no matter how unfair, because the alternative is to live with what he has done. He thanks the oracle. He turns. He begins walking toward Mycenae. The journey to the city takes him several days, and during those days he passes through villages where word has already spread. People come out of their homes to watch him go by, not with their usual cheers and gifts, but with a strange, quiet awe. They know what happened. They know where he is going. They understand, in some deep mortal way, that they are watching a legend be born out of the ashes of a man. Heracles barely notices them. He walks with his head down, his eyes on the dust of the road, the great lion-skin cloak he will one day wear nowhere yet in sight. When he arrives at the gates of Mycenae, the guards do not know whether to let him in or barricade themselves inside. They have all heard the stories. They know that this man could tear their walls apart with his bare hands if he wanted to. But Heracles announces himself simply, saying only that he has come to serve King Eurystheus by command of the oracle, and the guards, with shaking hands, open the gates. Eurystheus himself does not come out to greet him. The new king of Mycenae, who has spent his entire reign nervously eyeing the horizon for the day his terrifying cousin might show up, has barricaded himself inside his palace at the first news of Heracles' approach. By the time Heracles is ushered into the throne room, the king has already prepared a special hiding spot for himself. According to one version of the story, he has had a large bronze jar buried in the floor beneath his throne. The idea is that if Heracles becomes violent, Eurystheus can leap into the jar, slam the lid, and be safely tucked away underground until someone with a sword comes to deal with the problem. It is the kind of plan that only makes sense if you're the kind of man who hides in jars. When Heracles enters the throne room, he kneels before his cousin without raising his eyes. He says he has come to atone, that he will perform any task the king commands, and that he will not leave until the 10 years are complete. Eurystheus, watching him from a safe distance, tries very hard to look kingly. His advisors stand around him, all of them holding back the urge to laugh or scream. The man kneeling on the floor could lift this entire palace and throw it into the sea. The man on the throne could not lift a particularly heavy dinner plate without straining his back, and yet, by the bizarre arithmetic of fate, the first one must obey the second. The court watches in silence as Eurystheus clears his throat. He has been planning this moment for months. He knows exactly what he wants Heracles to do first. Behind the king, a young messenger steps forward holding a scroll. The labours have been chosen. They have been carefully designed to be impossible. Each one is a death sentence wrapped in a quest, each one selected for the kind of horror that no mortal could possibly survive. The king does not want his cousin to succeed. The king wants his cousin to die honourably and inconveniently far away, so that Eurystheus can sleep at night without nightmares about jars. The first labour, Eurystheus announces, is to be the Nemean Lion. Heracles raises his head slowly. He has heard of the lion. Everyone has. It is a beast that has been terrorising the countryside near the town of Nemea for years, an enormous creature whose hide cannot be pierced by any weapon ever forged by men or gods. Hunters have tried, soldiers have tried, entire armies have been sent against it. Their bones now decorate the entrance to the lion's cave like grim wind chimes. The beast itself is said to be the child of the monster Typhon, the worst nightmare the earth has ever produced, and the serpent Echidna, the mother of monsters herself. It is not, in other words, the kind of cat you can scare off by clapping your hands. The villages near Nemea have been emptying out for months. Farmers have abandoned their fields. Shepherds have driven their flocks to faraway pastures and never returned. Travellers who once crossed the valley to reach the great markets of the south now take long, expensive detours through the mountains, which is rarely a good sign in any economy. The lion has grown bold enough to walk into villages in broad daylight, dragging away whoever it pleases, with the calm disinterest of an animal that has never met anything that could hurt it. The local people have begun leaving offerings of livestock outside the valley, the way one might leave a peace offering for an angry god. The lion eats the offerings and then takes whoever brought them, which suggests that diplomacy is not really on the table. Hercules listens to the description of the monster he's being sent to kill. He does not flinch, he does not argue, he simply nods, rises from his kneeling position, and turns to walk out of the throne room. The advisors watch him go with their mouths hanging open. They had expected protest, or at least a question or two about strategy. Instead, the hero who has lost everything walks out the doors and into the countryside with no plan, no army, and no weapon better than the simple wooden club he has carried since boyhood. But Eurystheus, peering nervously from his throne, allows himself a small smile. He's almost certain he will never see Hercules again. The Nemean Lion has eaten every man who ever entered its valley. There is no reason to think this one will be any different, demigod blood or no demigod blood. The king goes back to his palace meal, lifts a goblet of wine to his lips, and tries to convince himself that his troubles will be over by the end of the week. He is wrong, of course. He is wrong about almost everything. The labours are not going to end Hercules, the labours are going to forge him. Every monster he kills, every river he turns, every cursed beast he drags back to Mycenae will burn away another piece of the man who once knelt sobbing in his ruined home, and replace it with something harder, something stranger, something closer to the legend his name would eventually become. The 10 years that lie ahead of him are going to be the worst 10 years any man has ever lived. They are also going to be the years that decide whether the world remembers him as a tragic figure who lost everything, or as the greatest hero who ever walked the earth. For now, though, none of that has happened yet. For now, Hercules is just a man with a club and a road in front of him, walking toward a valley where something with claws is waiting in the dark. The cicadas hum in the olive trees. The dust rises behind his sandals. Somewhere far above, on a mountain of clouds, a goddess watches him with cold eyes and smiles, certain that her revenge is finally beginning in earnest. She has no idea what she has just set in motion. None of them do. Not Hera, not Eurystheus, not the trembling court at Mycenae, not even Hercules himself. They all believe they are at the beginning of an ending. They are wrong. They are at the beginning of a beginning, the kind of story that will outlast the kingdom of Mycenae, outlast the temple at Delphi, outlast the empires of Greece and Rome, and every empire that follows them, all the way down through the centuries until tonight, when you and I are still sitting here, in the quiet hours, turning the pages of a story far older than anyone alive. The labours are about to begin, and Hercules, who does not know yet that he is becoming the most famous mortal who ever lived, takes another step forward into the long, slow night of his greatest trial. The valley of Nemea waits for him just over the horizon. Somewhere in its rocky hills, a beast that has eaten kings and warriors stretches in the shade of a cave, yawning the way a well-fed predator yawns when it has not been hungry in a very long time. Neither of them yet knows that one of them will not be walking out of that valley alive. The road from Mycenae to Nemea winds through dry hills and silent olive groves, and Hercules walks it alone. He carries no shield, no armour, no clever plan. His only weapons are a heavy wooden club, a bow with a quiver of ordinary arrows, and a body that has been forged by years of accidental property damage. As he approaches the valley, the landscape itself begins to tell him exactly how seriously to take this assignment. The grass has grown wild because no shepherds dare graze their flocks here. The road is overgrown because no merchants risk the journey anymore. The few stone houses that once stood near the valley are abandoned, their doors hanging open, their hearths cold. It is, as far as real estate goes, the kind of neighbourhood that should come with a substantial discount. On the second evening of his journey, Hercules stops at the home of an elderly farmer named Malorchus, the last man stubborn enough to still live within walking distance of the lion. The old man invites him in, shares a simple meal of bread and goat cheese, and listens with growing alarm as his guest explains what he has come to do. Malorcus, who is preparing a ram for sacrifice in the name of the gods, suggests waiting a few days so that the sacrifice can be made properly before such a dangerous undertaking. Hercules, ever practical, tells him to wait 30 days. If Hercules returns alive within that time, they will sacrifice the ram together to Zeus in thanks. If he does not return, Malorcus should sacrifice it to him as a hero of the dead. The old farmer agrees, but his hands are shaking as he says it. He has buried too many young men who walked into that valley with confidence. The next morning, Hercules enters the valley of Nemea. The silence there is the kind of silence that has weight to it. No birds sing, no crickets chirp. Even the wind seems to hold its breath. He finds the lion's tracks easily enough, paws the size of dinner plates pressed into the dirt, and follows them along a dry riverbed up into the hills. He climbs through scrubby brush, past piles of bones that have long since gone white in the sun, and eventually spots the entrance to the cave where the great beast makes its lair. It is, as caves go, not a particularly hospitable one. The walls outside are scarred with claw marks. The stone is stained dark from years of feasting. The smell that drifts out of the opening could politely be described as challenging. Hercules takes a position behind a boulder and waits. He has heard the stories about the lion's hide, how no spear or sword can pierce it. He does not entirely believe these stories. He has always found that monsters sound more impressive in songs than they turn out to be in person. So when the lion finally emerges from its cave in the late afternoon, stretching and yawning like a house cat the size of a small barn, he raises his bow and fires the first arrow. The arrow bounces off the lion's shoulder as if it had been shot at a stone wall. The lion looks down at the arrow, looks back toward Hercules, and seems mildly offended at the interruption. Hercules fires again. Same result. He empties his entire quiver into the beast, watching every arrow snap or ricochet off harmlessly. The lion, in turn, observes this entire performance with the patient curiosity of an animal that has never been afraid of anything. Hercules drops the bow. He picks up his club, which is made of solid olive wood and weighs about as much as a small horse. He charges the lion and brings the club down on its head with the kind of force that should, by all the laws of mortal combat, end this fight immediately. The club shatters. The lion blinks. Hercules is now standing in a valley with a slightly annoyed lion the size of a hay cart, holding a splintered stick. It is the kind of moment that would cause most heroes to reconsider their career choices. But Hercules has nothing left to lose. He has already lost everything that mattered to him. The lion charges, and instead of running, Hercules drops the broken club and runs directly toward the beast. He gets one massive arm around its neck, the other around its shoulder, and squeezes with the full force of his demigod strength. The lion roars. The lion thrashes. The lion does everything a lion can possibly do to dislodge the strange creature now wrapped around its throat. But Hercules does not let go. He cannot let go. If he lets go, he dies, and somehow, even after everything, he has discovered that he does not want to die just yet. The struggle goes on long enough that the sun begins to set behind the western hills. According to some versions of the story, the lion is so confused by an enemy who refuses to give up that it actually retreats into its cave, dragging Hercules along with it. The cave has two entrances, and the clever hero blocks one of them with boulders before resuming the fight in the smaller space, where the lion's tremendous size becomes a disadvantage. By the time the moon rises over the valley, the lion of Nemea is dead, killed by the only weapon that could pierce its hide. Hercules emerges from the cave covered in dust and blood, dragging the enormous body behind him. He sits on a rock outside the cave for a long while, catching his breath. The valley around him is quiet for the first time in years. No distant roars echo from the hills. No frightened animals scatter through the brush. The silence has changed quality, from the silence of fear into something closer to the silence of relief. Somewhere far down the slope, a single bird starts to sing, the first bird brave enough to return to this valley in a generation. Hercules listens to it for a while. He has not heard birdsong in a place like this for so long that the sound almost feels miraculous. Now comes a strange problem. The hide cannot be cut with any normal blade. Hercules tries his own knife. He tries sharpened stones. He tries the broken pieces of his club. Nothing works. He sits on a rock outside the cave, staring at the corpse of the lion he just killed, deeply puzzled by the fact that he cannot now skin it. According to one version of the legend, The goddess Athena herself appears at this moment, perhaps amused by the situation, and gently suggests that the only thing sharp enough to cut a lion's claw is the lion's own claw. Hercules, who is feeling slightly foolish, takes one of the great hooked claws and uses it to peel the hide free in a single careful motion. He drapes it across his shoulders. The head, jaws still attached, becomes a hood that frames his face. From this moment on, the lion's pelt becomes the most famous piece of clothing in the ancient world. No weapon will ever again pierce his skin. He has walked into the valley a man and walks out a legend in progress. He returns to Mallorcus on the 30th day, exactly when he had promised. The old farmer drops the ram he's preparing, falls to his knees, and weeps with relief. Together they sacrifice the animal to Zeus, exactly as planned, and that night the two of them eat a quiet meal under the stars. Hercules does not boast. He never does, not really. He simply mentions that the lion will no longer be a problem, and asks for directions back to Mycenae. When he arrives at the palace of Eurystheus, dragging the great corpse of the Nemean Lion behind him on a sled of fresh-cut branches, the king is having his afternoon nap. A servant rushes in to wake him with the news. Eurystheus, half asleep, walks out to the courtyard, glances at the dead lion, and immediately turns the colour of old porridge. The size of the animal is one thing. The fact that his cousin has actually killed it is something else entirely. The king's careful plan to be rid of Hercules has not worked, and worse, the man standing in his courtyard is now wearing the lion's hide like a second skin, looking taller, harder, and significantly more terrifying than he had on his way out. Eurystheus immediately retreats inside the palace and slams the doors. From that day forward he announces that Hercules is no longer permitted inside the city walls of Mycenae. Future labours will be delivered by a herald named Cerberus, who will shout the assignments from a safe distance. The king himself will conduct his rule from behind locked doors and, when truly worried, from inside his trusty bronze jar. The trembling courtiers, who had hoped the labours would solve their cousin problem, now realise they will be living with this arrangement for the next 10 years. Many of them quietly begin updating their employment plans. The second labour arrives quickly, shouted through the palace gates by Cerberus, with the trembling enthusiasm of a man delivering bad news he wants to be very far away from. Hercules must travel to the swamps of Lerna and destroy the Hydra, a many-headed serpent that has been poisoning the waters and devouring travellers for as long as anyone can remember. The Hydra is the offspring of the same monstrous parents as the Nemean Lion, which makes it, technically, a kind of sister to the beast he just killed. Mythology is a small world. The Hydra, however, is not just a bigger snake. She has a particularly inconvenient feature that has made her impossible to kill for generations. Every time someone cuts off one of her heads, 2 new heads grow back from the stump within seconds. The math, as you may already be calculating, does not work in any hero's favour. Cut off 1 head, get 2 heads. Cut off those 2, get 4. Each round of combat actually makes the monster more dangerous, which is exactly the kind of biological feature that no one wants in their local swamp. Several heroes had tried over the years, and the marshes are now decorated with their remains in a manner that suggests the Hydra finds visitors entertaining. Hercules, sensibly, decides to bring help this time. He travels first to the city of Tiryns to collect his young nephew Iolaus, the son of his twin brother Iphicles. Iolaus is a quick-witted, brave young man who has idolized his uncle since childhood. He climbs into Heracles' chariot with the kind of grin that suggests he has no idea what he has just signed up for. They drive together to the edge of the swamp, where Heracles ties their horses to a tree at a safe distance and explains the plan. The plan, as he describes it, has 2 phases. Phase 1, Heracles will get the Hydra's attention. Phase 2, Iolaus will do something extremely important with a torch. Iolaus nods and tries to look confident, although he has not yet been told what that important thing will be. It is worth pausing here to note something about Iolaus that often gets overlooked. He is not a demigod. He has no special powers, no divine blood, no magical weapons. He is, by every measure that mattered in ancient Greece, an ordinary young man volunteering to walk into a swamp with a creature that had eaten armies. He goes anyway. Greek mythology is full of grand figures who do impossible things because they are partly divine. Iolaus is a reminder that some of the bravest people in any story are the perfectly mortal ones who just decide to show up. He will spend most of his life standing in the background of Heracles' adventures, ready with a torch, a horse, or a kind word at exactly the moment it is needed. History remembers him less than it should. The Hydra's lair is at the source of the river Amymone, a deep cavern shaded by a great plane tree. Heracles cannot lure her out with shouts or arrows, so he soaks burning rags around his arrows and fires them into the cave, smoking her out the way one might evict a stubborn wasp. The Hydra comes out angry. She is enormous. Her body coils through the muddy water like a knot of pythons, and her many heads rear up in different directions, each one snapping with venomous fangs. The smell of her breath alone is said to kill small animals at 20 paces, which is the kind of detail that probably did not appear in the original job description from Eurystheus. Heracles wades into the swamp with his sword raised. He swings, and the first head falls. As predicted, 2 new heads sprout immediately from the wound, hissing furiously. He swings again. Same result. He swings 10 times, then 20, and within minutes he is surrounded by more heads than he started with, all of them lunging for him from every angle. To make matters worse, Hera, watching from above, has sent a giant crab to assist the Hydra. The crab scuttles out of the water and clamps its enormous claw down on Heracles' foot. It is, frankly, the worst possible day to be wearing open sandals. Heracles crushes the crab beneath his heel without breaking stride. The crab will eventually be placed in the night sky by Hera as the constellation Cancer, mostly as a participation award for getting that close to one of her enemies. But the Hydra remains, and the problem of the regenerating heads is still very much unsolved. This is when Heracles finally remembers his nephew. He shouts for Iolaus. The young man, who has been watching the fight from behind the chariot with wide, terrified eyes, runs forward with the torch he had been holding all along. Heracles cuts off another head and shouts for Iolaus to press the burning torch against the bleeding stump. Iolaus obeys, slamming the flames against the wound, and the stump sizzles, blackens, and seals shut. No new heads grow. The 2 of them have just discovered the solution. Together they work through the entire Hydra in a chaotic dance of swords and fire, Heracles severing each head while Iolaus cauterizes the wound before regeneration can begin. It takes hours. They are both exhausted, drenched in muddy swamp water, and worse by the time they finish. Only 1 head is left. According to the stories, this final head is immortal and cannot be killed. Heracles takes care of it the only way he can. He cuts it off with a single mighty swing, drags it to the side of the road, and buries it beneath an enormous boulder so heavy that no creature on earth can roll it aside. As long as the boulder remains, the head remains trapped. The rest of the Hydra's body lies dead in the swamp, finally finished after generations of terrorizing the region. Before leaving, Heracles makes one more practical decision. The Hydra's blood is famously toxic, the most potent venom in the known world. He carefully dips his arrows in the dark, oily blood, coating the tips. From now on, even the slightest scratch from one of his arrows will kill whatever it touches. It is a battlefield advantage so extreme that it almost feels unfair. He does not know yet that this same poison will eventually be responsible for ending his own story, decades from now. The gifts that monsters leave behind, as it turns out, have a way of finding their way home. The journey back to Mycenae is long, and Heracles is in good spirits for the first time in months. He has now completed 2 labours, both of which were supposed to kill him. He arrives at the palace gates, throws down the proof of the Hydra's defeat in the form of one of her enormous severed heads, and announces his success. He waits for the king's response. There is a long pause. Then Capreus, the herald, clears his throat from the safety of the parapet above. The king, Capreus announces, regrets to inform Heracles that the second labour will not be counted. Why? Because Heracles received help from his nephew. The original conditions, Eurystheus insists, required him to complete each task alone, and Iolaus's torchwork disqualifies the entire effort. Heracles will need to do another labour in its place. The injustice of it sits in the air for a moment. Heracles, standing in his lion-skin cloak with the blood of the Hydra still on his hands, simply looks up at the parapet and says nothing. He does not protest. He does not rage. He has long since accepted that the rules of his punishment are not fair and were never going to be fair. He nods once, turns, and walks away without further argument. But somewhere on Olympus the fates take careful note of this moment. A debt of injustice has been opened in the cosmic ledger. It will not be closed easily. The third labour arrives within the week. This one, Eurystheus believes, is genuinely impossible. Heracles must capture the Xerinian hind, a magnificent deer with golden antlers and bronze hooves, sacred to the goddess Artemis. The hind is said to be faster than any arrow ever fired, more nimble than any horse, and possessed of an almost supernatural awareness of being hunted. Mortals have glimpsed it for centuries, always at a distance, always disappearing into the woods before any approach can be made. To capture it, you would need either extraordinary cleverness or extraordinary patience. To capture it alive, which is the requirement, you would need both, plus considerable luck. To capture it without offending Artemis, who notoriously turns men into stags for far smaller insults, would require the kind of divine diplomacy that only the very brave or the very foolish ever attempt. Hercules, of course, does not have a choice. He sets out at once, travelling north into the wild lands of Arcadia, where the hind has been sighted most frequently. What follows is not a fight. It is not a hunt in any normal sense of the word. It is instead the world's longest game of patience. Hercules pursues the hind through hills, across rivers, through forests so thick that sunlight barely reaches the ground. The deer always stays just out of reach. Every time he gets close, it bounds away with impossible grace, leaping over chasms and threading between trees as if it were made of wind. He follows it across the borders of Greece, through the territories of friendly cities and hostile ones, through summer and into autumn and through the long cold months of winter. He sleeps under the stars, he drinks from streams, he hunts smaller game to feed himself while the great deer he is actually chasing watches from a hilltop somewhere, perhaps mildly amused. This goes on for a full year. By the time Heracles finally manages to catch the hind, he has crossed nearly every region of the ancient world, and he has done so on foot. The actual moment of capture is almost gentle. He finds the hind drinking from a river one morning, exhausted from a year of constant flight, and rather than risk killing her with an arrow, he wades carefully into the water and simply lifts her into his arms. The deer does not struggle. It seems, in that moment, almost relieved that the chase is over. It is a strange thing to consider, but the third labour may have been the one that did the most to heal Heracles inwardly. The fight with the lion had tested his strength. The battle with the hydra had tested his cleverness. But the year-long chase of the hind had given him something he had not had in a long time, which was solitude with a purpose. Long days walking through forests with nothing to do but follow a trail. Quiet nights under unfamiliar stars. Conversations with shepherds and old women in villages he would never see again. He had time to think, time to grieve, time to slowly come back into his own skin. The hunt had been a kind of pilgrimage in disguise, and by the time he caught the hind, he was no longer quite the broken man who had limped out of Mycenae a year before. He turns toward Mycenae, and almost immediately the trouble begins. The goddess Artemis appears on the path before him, her face cold with anger. Her twin brother Apollo stands beside her, his bow already in his hand. The two divine siblings are not amused. The hind belongs to Artemis. It is one of her sacred companions, beloved above almost all other creatures. To touch it without her permission is the kind of offence that has historically ended very badly for the mortal involved. Heracles, for the second time in his life, does the smartest thing he has ever done. He kneels. He sets the hind gently on the ground, and he explains, calmly and respectfully, every detail of his situation. He tells Artemis about his madness, his lost family, his sentence at the Oracle of Delphi, the cruelty of Eurystheus, the unfairness of having his second labour disqualified, and the requirement that he must now bring this hind to Mycenae or fail his entire path of atonement. He does not lie, he does not flatter, he simply tells the truth, and the truth, when delivered honestly, has a strange power even over angry goddesses. Artemis listens. Her bow remains lowered. When he finishes, she stands silent for a long moment, considering him. Then she gives him permission, on one condition. He must bring the hind to Mycenae alive, show it to Eurystheus, and then release it back into the wild so it can return to her sacred forest. Heracles agrees instantly. He thanks her with the kind of bowed respect that goddesses appreciate from heroes, picks up the hind, and walks back toward the king with the divine green light he had never expected to receive. Eurystheus, when he sees Heracles approaching with the legendary hind cradled in his arms like a particularly large house cat, hides inside the palace as usual. He does, however, peer out a window long enough to confirm that yes, the labour has been completed. He then waves dismissively, indicating that the hind should be released according to whatever bargain Heracles has worked out. He is too nervous to argue with anything involving Artemis. The deer leaps from Heracles' arms and bounds away into the distance, returning to her sacred forest within a few days, having spent the past year inadvertently giving the strongest man alive a thorough walking tour of Greece. The fourth labour follows almost immediately. Heracles is to capture the Erymanthian boar, a massive tusked monster that has been terrorising the slopes of Mount Erymanthos. The boar is not magical in the way the hind was, nor invulnerable like the lion. It is simply enormous, vicious, and bad-tempered. It charges anything that moves, tears apart villages for entertainment, and has a particular fondness for trampling vineyards in the early autumn. The boar must be brought back alive, which is the kind of detail Eurystheus seems to add specifically because it makes everything harder. On his way to Mount Erymanthos, Heracles passes through a region inhabited by the centaurs, the half-man, half-horse creatures of Greek myth. The centaurs are a strange and varied people. Some are wise, gentle, and learned. Others are wild, hot-tempered, and dangerous when provoked. Heracles is welcomed at the cave of a particularly hospitable centaur named Pholus, an old friend who lays out a fine meal of roasted meat and asks his guest about his journey. They talk for hours, like two old soldiers swapping stories. Then Heracles, perhaps too casually, asks for some wine to go with the meal. This is where everything goes wrong. Pholus has a sacred jar of wine in his cave, one that was given to the centaurs long ago by the god Dionysus himself, with strict instructions that it was meant for all of centaur kind. To open it for a single guest, no matter how distinguished, is technically a violation of the gift. Pholus hesitates. Heracles, who is perhaps in too good a mood after his recent victories, encourages him. The seal is broken. The jar is opened. The rich, divine aroma of the wine pours out of the cave and drifts across the mountainside, and the other centaurs smell it. Within minutes, dozens of wild centaurs come thundering down from the hills, furious that their sacred wine has been opened without permission. They are not in a mood to negotiate. They charge the cave armed with stones, branches, and rough weapons of their own making, ready to punish whoever has insulted their tradition. Heracles is forced to defend himself. The fight that follows is chaotic, confused, and deeply unfortunate. He has no quarrel with the centaurs personally, but they are trying to overrun the cave, and his only weapons are the poisoned arrows he carries from the Hydra. He fires them quickly, defending the entrance. The arrows do exactly what arrows dipped in Hydra venom tend to do, with the kind of grim efficiency that no one in the situation actually wanted. The centaurs scatter. Many are wounded by the poisoned arrows. One of those wounded is a centaur named Chiron, who happens to be one of the wisest beings in all of mythology, the legendary tutor of Achilles, Jason, Asclepius, and even Heracles himself in his younger years. Chiron has done nothing wrong. He was not even part of the angry mob, only present in the area, and the arrow had been a stray shot. He is, however, also immortal, which means the Hydra's poison cannot kill him outright. Instead, it will torment him for as long as he lives, which is essentially forever. Chiron, in his agony, eventually makes one of the most quietly heroic decisions in all of Greek myth. He goes to Zeus and asks to be allowed to trade places with the Titan Prometheus, who is being punished elsewhere in a story we will get to later. By doing so, Chiron willingly gives up his immortality so that he can finally die in peace. His sacrifice releases Prometheus and ends his own suffering. He is later placed in the night sky as a constellation, honoured as one of the rare beings who chose mortality out of pure compassion. Pholus, the original host, also dies in the aftermath. While examining one of the arrows that had killed a fellow centaur, he accidentally drops it on his own foot. The poison takes him quickly. Heracles, returning from the chase of the remaining centaurs, finds his friend on the floor of the cave and buries him with heavy heart on the mountainside. Two innocents are dead. One of them was his teacher, the other was his host. He had not intended any of it, but intentions do not erase consequences, and the weight of that day will follow him for years. Not all the centaurs are killed. Many escape into the deeper wilderness, but one in particular survives and remembers. His name is Nessus. He is younger than the others, faster, and carries his bitterness with the patience of a snake. He watches from the hills as Heracles buries Pholus, and he makes a quiet vow that the day will come when he returns this debt with interest. He does not need to act yet. He can wait, decades, if necessary. The fates are patient with their threads, and so is Nessus. It is one of the strange and beautiful cruelties of Greek mythology that small moments often grow into enormous consequences. A wine jar opened too eagerly, an arrow fired into a crowd, a single centaur who escapes when the others do not. None of it looked important on the day it happened. None of it would have been remembered if life had gone gently afterward. But the world rarely rewards gentleness, and these forgotten moments have a habit of returning at exactly the wrong time, dressed in the clothes of accidents, carrying knives of long memory. Hercules will learn this lesson eventually. He has not learned it yet. Hercules, unaware of the long shadow that has just been cast across his future, finally continues his journey up Mount Erymanthos. After the disaster with the centaurs, the boar almost feels like a relief. It is a large, angry pig. It does not have magical powers. It does not have allies. It simply has to be caught. Hercules drives the boar up into the highest parts of the mountain, where deep snow has piled in the winter passes. The animal, with its short legs, becomes stuck in the deep drifts. Hercules wades in after it, slings it over his shoulders, and carries the entire enormous beast back down the mountain alive, tusks still snapping at the air behind him. The return to Mycenae brings what is probably the funniest moment of all the labours so far. Heracles strolls into the palace courtyard carrying an enormous, angry, alive boar over his shoulders. The courtyard is full of attendants and minor officials going about their daily business. They look up. They see the strongest man in the world casually holding a thrashing mountain pig the size of an ox cart. They begin running in several directions at once. Eurystheus, hearing the commotion, looks out a window, sees the boar, and dives headfirst into his trusty bronze jar with a speed that suggests he has been practicing. The lid slams shut. The king's voice echoes weakly from inside the bronze, demanding that the boar be taken away immediately. Heracles, standing alone in the empty courtyard with a struggling pig on his shoulders and a faintly muffled monarch shouting from a buried pot, allows himself the smallest, driest smile he has smiled in years. He's starting to suspect that the labours are not going to kill him after all. He's starting to suspect that against all the planning of every god and king involved, he might actually finish all of them. The boar is eventually released into the wild far from any settlement, where it presumably lives out the rest of its days terrorising nothing more important than acorns. Heracles takes a moment to consider what just happened. He has now completed 4 impossible tasks. He has killed 2 unkillable monsters and captured 2 creatures no mortal was supposed to catch. He has survived an ambush by a small army of centaurs and walked away with the goodwill of one of the most temperamental goddesses on Olympus. By any reasonable measure, he is the most successful failure in history, a man being punished for crimes he never meant to commit, and somehow succeeding at every punishment thrown at him. Up on Olympus, the mood is shifting. The other gods, who had assumed Hera's plan would quietly dispose of her stepson within a labour or 2, are beginning to murmur. Athena, who has always had a soft spot for clever mortals, watches Heracles with growing interest. Hermes finds the whole drama deeply amusing and starts dropping hints near Hera's throne about scoreboards and underdogs. Hera herself does not laugh. She simply tightens her jaw and begins drafting the next set of obstacles in her head. If the easier labours will not finish him, then the next ones will need to be considerably more creative. The horizon stretches ahead, and somewhere out there, the next monster waits. The 5th labour begins not with a monster but with a smell. A truly impressive smell. A smell so profound that travellers had been giving the region a wide berth for a generation. King Ogyges of Elis, somewhere in the western Peloponnese, owns the largest herd of cattle in all of Greece, gifted to him by the gods themselves. His herds number in the thousands, possibly tens of thousands, and his bulls and cows are blessed with divine fertility, meaning they multiply faster than any mortal accounting system can really keep up with. There is, however, one small administrative oversight in this otherwise glorious operation. King Ogyges has not, in 30 years, gotten around to cleaning the stables. 30 years of cattle. The stables themselves, which were once spacious wooden structures with airy stone floors, have over the decades become something closer to a slowly expanding geological feature. The waste has built up so thoroughly that the very land around the palace has been rendered unfit for farming. Crops will not grow. Wells have been poisoned. The smell has been described in ancient sources with the kind of breathless adjectives that historians usually save for natural disasters. Anyone with a reasonable nose has long since moved several valleys away. The poor servants who still live near the stables have stopped trying to clean them altogether, having concluded that the project was, to use a polite phrase, beyond the scope of one lifetime's effort. It is worth pausing to appreciate just how impressive this accomplishment of neglect actually is. To let any stable go uncleaned for 30 years would already be a kind of historical achievement. To do it with a herd of divinely fertile cattle, multiplying like a particularly enthusiastic biological experiment, is something else entirely. Augeas, by all accounts, was not a lazy king in other matters. He governed his lands competently, kept his neighbours at peace, and oversaw a prosperous economy. He simply had one enormous blind spot, the kind everyone in the palace knew about but no one was brave enough to raise during meetings. Court officials had tried over the years to bring up the subject. They had been politely transferred to other duties. By the time Hercules arrived, the topic of the stables was the kind of thing one only whispered about at the very far end of long corridors, on days when the wind was blowing the other way. This is the task that Eurystheus, snug in his palace at Mycenae, decides to assign to his cousin next. He genuinely believes it is unsolvable. Even the strongest man in the world, he reasons, could not shovel his way through 30 years of cattle waste in a single day, which is the deadline he sets just to ensure failure. The image of Heracles humiliated and reeking, having spent days knee-deep in the world's most ambitious manure pile, brings the king the kind of joy that small-minded rulers extract from petty cruelties. He giggles about it for several afternoons in a row. Heracles, when the assignment is shouted at him through the city gates by Caprius the herald, simply nods and walks off. He does not seem particularly worried, which is frankly alarming to everyone watching. The cleaner of impossible places usually exhibits some sign of dread, and Heracles is not. He travels west to Elis at a steady pace, arrives at the palace of King Augeas, and presents himself politely. The king, who has been hearing rumours about the lion skin and the hydra and the boar, receives him cautiously. Now Heracles does something interesting. He does not mention Eurystheus. He does not mention the labours. He simply tells Augeas that he can clean the stables in a single day and asks for 1/10 of the king's herd as payment if he succeeds. Augeas, who has heard hundreds of cleaning proposals over the years and dismissed all of them, agrees instantly. He is so certain the task is impossible that he is willing to bet 1/10 of his cattle on it. He even calls his son Phileus as a witness, asking him to verify the terms of the agreement. Phileus is a thoughtful young man with a strong sense of fairness. He nods and confirms the deal in front of the court. The next morning Heracles walks down to the stables, takes one long, appraising look at the mountainous accumulation of waste, and then turns his back on it entirely. He does not pick up a shovel. He does not lift a single load. Instead, he walks to the river Alpheus, which flows past the kingdom of Elis on one side. Then he walks to the river Peneus, which flows past the kingdom on the other side. He studies the lay of the land. He measures angles with his eyes. He sets down his lion-skin cloak, rolls up his sleeves, and begins moving stones. What he is doing is engineering. Specifically, he is rerouting 2 rivers. It takes him most of the day. He digs new channels with his bare hands, lifts boulders the size of small wagons, breaks down hillsides, and reshapes the riverbeds until both rivers are angled directly toward the stables. Then, with a final mighty shove against a key stone, he releases the dams he has built. Both rivers come crashing down through the new channels at once, slamming into the stables from 2 sides like a watery siege engine. The waste, which had taken 30 years to accumulate, is washed away in a single tremendous flood. The water carries it downstream, through the fields, out to the distant sea, leaving the stables behind cleaner than they had been in living memory. Heracles then redirects the rivers back to their original courses, replants his stones, and walks back to the palace before dinner is served. It is, in the entire saga of his labours, the moment that demonstrates most clearly that Heracles is more than just muscle. He is a man who thinks. Most heroes facing the Augean problem would have started shoveling, the way Eurystheus expected him to start shoveling, and would have died of exhaustion or shame within a week. Heracles looked at the same task and asked a different question. Not, how do I move 30 years of waste? But, how do I get something else to move it for me? The answer was already standing on both sides of the kingdom, flowing patiently between its banks, waiting for someone clever enough to ask. There is a quiet lesson buried in this labour. and it is one of the lessons that makes the story endure. Strength alone solves nothing. Strength applied with intelligence solves the impossible. King Augeas, when he sees what has happened, turns several different colours in quick succession. His stables are clean, the smell is gone, his land is going to be able to grow crops again. But he has just promised 1/10 of his entire massive herd to a man who, the king suddenly remembers, is the cousin of Eurystheus, performing this labour at the command of another king. Augeas decides, in the breathtaking way that some rulers decide things, that the deal does not count. He claims that Hercules was already obligated to do the work for Eurystheus, that no payment can be owed for a task performed under royal command, and that the entire agreement was therefore void from the start. It is the kind of bad faith argument that has been used by wealthy people for as long as written contracts have existed. The work has been done, the reward had been agreed, but the powerful party, looking at the actual size of the bill, suddenly discovers a technicality and refuses to pay. The technicality, in this case, was not even particularly clever. Heracles had performed the work freely, on his own initiative, and had been promised payment freely in return. The deal had nothing to do with Eurystheus or the labours, but Augeas, having watched his own herds rescue themselves from ruin, was not about to part with 1/10 of them on a matter of principle. His son Phileus, who had witnessed the agreement, immediately objects. He stands in his father's own throne room and says, in front of the assembled court, that the deal was made and the deal must be honoured. His father refuses. Phileus, in his disgust, packs his belongings and leaves Elis the same day, exiling himself from his own father's kingdom out of principle. He moves to the island of Dulichium and never returns. Augeas, having alienated his own heir over a cattle dispute, then expels Heracles from his lands without payment. Heracles travels back to Mycenae in a quiet mood. He's starting to notice a pattern. The world he is now moving through is not particularly interested in fairness. Kings break their promises, cousins twist the rules, the good are punished, and the cunning rewarded. He files the lesson away without comment, but he does not forget it. When he reports the labour complete to Eurystheus, the king predictably refuses to count it, citing the now broken deal with Augeas. Heracles worked for pay, Eurystheus argues. A labourer working for pay is not a hero atoning for his sins. The labour is voided. Heracles will need to perform another in its place. That is now 2 labours disqualified out of 5 completed. Heracles stands silently in the courtyard, while the herald shouts the king's ruling from the safety of the parapet. He says nothing. But somewhere on Olympus the fates pull another thread tight, and the cosmic ledger of injustices grows a little heavier. King Augeas, in particular, has just earned himself a future visit. Heracles is a patient man when he needs to be. He will return to Elis someday, years from now, after the 10 years of labour are finished, and there will be a reckoning involving a small army and a particularly satisfying ending. But that is a story for later. The 6th labour follows almost immediately. Heracles is sent to Lake Stymphalia in northern Arcadia, where a vast flock of strange birds is gathered. The birds are not ordinary birds. According to the stories, they have feathers of polished bronze, beaks that can crack a shield, and droppings that are highly toxic. They were originally raised as the sacred birds of the war god Ares, and they have inherited his enthusiasm for chaos. The flock has been growing for years, driven from other regions by hungry wolves, and they have now settled around the lake in such numbers that they darken the sky every time they take flight. The local villages have been emptying out. Anyone unwise enough to walk too close to the lake risks being shredded by a sudden barrage of metal feathers, fired down from above like arrows from a divine archery contest. Even by the standards of mythological wildlife, these birds were a remarkable infestation. They had originally lived in much smaller numbers in another part of Greece, but a hard winter and a few seasons of bad luck had driven them in waves towards Stymphalia, which had abundant cover, abundant water, and very little in the way of predators willing to take on a creature with sharpened metal wings. The result, after a generation or two, was something closer to a slow-moving disaster zone than an ecosystem. Fish in the lake had died off from the poisoned droppings. The reeds along the shore had been stripped bare. Even the wolves of the region, who would normally have been the natural counterbalance to any growing flock, had quietly relocated to other forests. Wolves are clever animals. They knew when an opportunity was no longer an opportunity. The challenge here is not strength. Brute force will not work against a flock of thousands. The challenge is how to even get close enough to fight. The lake is surrounded by thick marshland, the kind of soft ground that swallows a man's foot up to the knee. Hercules cannot wade in to attack the birds at their nests, because the marsh will not hold him. He cannot fire arrows into the sky, because there are too many birds to make any meaningful difference, and they tend to scatter in great clouds whenever they sense a threat. He stands at the edge of the marsh for the better part of an afternoon, watching the metal-feathered flock circle and roost, and he is genuinely stumped. This is, mythology being mythology, the moment when divine help arrives. The goddess Athena, who has been watching his progress with growing approval, appears beside him with a small parcel in her hands. Inside are 2 enormous bronze rattles, forged by the blacksmith god Hephaestus himself in the divine workshops beneath Mount Olympus. They are objects of staggering craftsmanship, polished to a brilliant shine, and engineered to produce a sound so loud and so jarring that almost no creature on earth can stand it. Athena explains briefly that the birds, despite their armour and their venom, have one weakness. They cannot tolerate sudden, harsh noise. It overwhelms their senses and sends them into a panic. She wishes him luck, gives him a small encouraging nod, and disappears the way goddesses do, which is to say, without saying goodbye. Heracles climbs the nearest hill overlooking the lake. He waits for the sun to rise high enough that the birds are settled on their nests for the morning. Then he raises both rattles above his head, takes a deep breath, and brings them down with all the strength of his demigod arms. The sound is biblical. According to one ancient source, the noise of the bronze rattles in Heracles' hands could be heard from 20 miles away. The birds, every single one of them, explode upward from the marsh in a single panicking cloud. The sky goes dark with the beating of their bronze wings. They circle wildly, disoriented, unable to land, unable to focus, unable to do anything except flee from the unbearable sound. And as they fly past him in confused, scattered formations, Heracles puts the rattles down and picks up his bow. The arrows, you may recall, are still tipped in hydra venom from the second labour. The Stymphalian birds may have bronze feathers, but their eyes are not armoured. Their throats are not armoured. The gaps between the metal plumes leave just enough exposed flesh for a precise archer to make use of. Heracles is, by now, an extraordinarily precise archer. He shoots steadily, one bird at a time, picking off the closest of the flock as they wheel through the sky. The poison does the rest, and within a few hours the air around the lake is gradually thinning. Some birds are killed outright. Others, wounded, flee the region entirely and never return. The flock breaks apart and scatters to distant lands, eventually settling somewhere in the Black Sea, where another hero named Jason will encounter their descendants generations later. But Lake Stymphalia itself is finally free of them. When Heracles returns to Mycenae and reports the labour complete, Eurystheus does not even bother coming out to see the evidence. He just waves through a window and tells Capreus to give him the next assignment. He cannot disqualify this one. There was no helper. There was no payment. There was only a man with a pair of magical rattles and a quiver of poisoned arrows, which Eurystheus reluctantly concedes is fair. The labour counts. The king does not seem pleased about this. The local people around Lake Stymphalia, on the other hand, are delighted. Villagers who had not dared to walk down to the shore in years return to find that the lake is no longer a death zone. The poisoned waters slowly recover. Fish return within a season. The reeds grow back. Travellers begin using the old roads again. Heracles never asks for thanks, and he certainly does not stay for a celebration, but the people of the region will remember him for generations. Shrines to him are quietly built in the surrounding villages, small altars where farmers leave flowers before going out into the fields, the kind of folk worship that survives long after grand temples have crumbled. By the time Heracles is several days into his next journey, an old shepherd somewhere near the lake is already telling his grandchildren the story of the man who came with 2 bronze rattles and saved their valley. The grandchildren will remember it. Their grandchildren will too. The 7th labour takes Heracles overseas for the first time. He's sent to the island of Crete, far to the south of the Greek mainland, to capture a creature known simply as the Cretan bull. The animal had once been a gift from the sea god Poseidon to King Minos of Crete, a magnificent white bull sent up from the waves on the condition that Minos would sacrifice it to Poseidon in return. Minos, however, fell in love with the bull's beauty and kept it for himself, sacrificing a lesser animal instead. Poseidon, who does not handle being cheated with anything resembling grace, took his revenge in the most elaborate way possible. He drove the bull mad with divine fury, and from this madness came a long chain of disasters for Crete, including the eventual birth of the Minotaur, half man and half bull, who would later become a story all its own. The bull itself, however, was not the Minotaur. It was the father of the Minotaur, still running wild through the Cretan countryside, trampling crops and uprooting orchards with the kind of focused destruction that only divine punishment can really achieve. The lesson of King Minos, briefly stated, was that one does not accept a gift from Poseidon and then withhold the agreed-upon payment. Poseidon is the kind of god who keeps a careful ledger. Promises made to him accrue interest. Minos had thought, when he kept the beautiful bull for his own herds, that he was being clever. He had calculated that the sea god would not notice the substitution, or would forgive a small inconsistency in exchange for the increased glory of his kingdom. He had calculated wrong. The chain of disasters that followed his choice would eventually cost his family more than any honest sacrifice ever could have. Crete itself would carry the consequences for generations. The bull was only the first of them. Hercules takes a ship to Crete, where King Minos meets him at the harbour. The king is frankly delighted by the visit. He offers Hercules every resource of his kingdom, even troops of his own soldiers to help with the capture. Hercules politely declines all assistance. He has learned, after the disqualification of the Hydra labour, not to accept help when help can be avoided. He sets out alone across the island, follows the trail of broken fences and flattened olive groves, and eventually catches up with the bull near the eastern coast. The bull is, in scale and temper, exactly what one would expect from a creature driven mad by a sea god. It charges Hercules the moment he steps into the field. Most heroes would have braced for impact. Hercules instead simply sidesteps at the last moment, grabs one of the enormous horns as the bull passes, and uses its own momentum to swing himself onto its back. The bull bucks, the bull thrashes, the bull tries every trick in the bovine playbook to dislodge the rider, and none of them work. Eventually, after a great deal of stomping and snorting, the animal simply runs out of energy. Hercules, who has been riding it through several fields and one shallow river, slides off, ties a rope around its neck and leads it down to the shore. The bull, exhausted and somewhat humiliated, follows like an oversized dog. What happens next is one of the most genuinely strange images in all of Greek mythology. Hercules cannot fit a bull of this size into any normal ship. So, according to the legends, he simply walks the bull into the sea and rides it across the entire Mediterranean back to mainland Greece, gripping the horns and steering with his knees. The Cretan bull, possibly subdued by the salt water and the sheer absurdity of its situation, swims faithfully all the way to the Peloponnese. Sailors who witnessed the crossing later described seeing the strongest man alive perched atop a swimming bull, drifting calmly past their vessels in the open sea like the world's most unconventional ferry passenger. None of them, by all accounts, knew what to say. There is something genuinely funny about imagining the cultural impact this must have had at the time. The merchant ships of the ancient Mediterranean carried not just goods, but stories, and stories of this kind would have spread from port to port faster than the goods themselves. A man crossing the open ocean on the back of a swimming bull is the sort of thing that travels well in taverns. By the time Hercules reached Mycenae with his captive, half the coastal cities in Greece had already heard rumours about him, and the rumours had grown in the telling. Some versions had the bull glowing in the moonlight as it swam. Some had Hercules singing to it as they crossed. Some had a school of dolphins escorting them the entire way, as if Poseidon himself had decided to make up for the original insult with a final dramatic gesture. The truth, whatever it actually was, almost did not matter. The legend had begun to build itself. When Hercules arrives at the palace of Mycenae with a fully tamed sacred bull on a rope, Eurystheus, who has been watching from his usual safe vantage point, immediately panics. The king refuses to take the animal into his herds, presumably worried that something cursed by a sea god is not the kind of livestock you want grazing near your dining hall. He orders the bull released into the wild. The bull, free of its divine madness now that it has been thoroughly worn out by the trip, simply wanders north into Greece, eventually settling in the plain of Marathon. There it will remain for many years, growing into a different legend entirely, until another hero named Theseus eventually catches it and sacrifices it properly. The world, as you can see, recycles its monsters efficiently. The eighth labour pulls Hercules further from home than any task before. He is sent north, to the wild lands of Thrace, where a king named Diomedes rules over a savage tribe called the Bistones. Diomedes is not the kind of king who hosts dinner parties or signs trade agreements. He is a cruel man with a particularly disturbing habit. He owns 4 legendary mares, horses of unusual size and ferocity, and he has trained them to eat human flesh. Every traveller who has the misfortune of arriving in his kingdom is captured by his guards and fed to the horses. Over the years, the mares have developed a permanent taste for it, growing wild and bloodthirsty in their iron-walled stable. Their names, recorded carefully in the old myths, are Podagros, Lampon, Xanthus and Deinos, although in practice everyone simply called them the mares of Diomedes and tried not to think about them too hard. Thrace itself is a different sort of land from southern Greece. The people there had a fierce reputation, fond of warfare and famous for breeding the strongest horses in the known world. Even the ordinary horses of Thrace were considered superior to almost any other breed, prized by kings and warriors throughout the Mediterranean. Diomedes had taken this regional gift for horsemanship and twisted it into something terrible. His 4 mares were said to be descended from the horses of his own ancestors, animals already enormous and strong, who had been corrupted into man-eaters through years of cruel training and a steady diet that no animal should ever have known. The local Bistone people were largely indifferent to what their king was doing. Some of them even helped him, hunting travellers in the woods and dragging captives to the palace gates in exchange for royal favours. It was, by any standard, a deeply unpleasant kingdom to find oneself in by accident. Hercules travels to Thrace with a small group of companions this time. The journey is long, and the company makes it more bearable. Chief among his companions is a young man named Abderus, the son of the god Hermes and a dear friend of Heracles. Abderus is bright, eager, brave in the way only the young can be brave, the kind of person who lights up a room the moment he enters it. Heracles has come to love him like the brother he never quite had in Iphicles. They travel north together, share meals around campfires, and tell each other stories under unfamiliar stars. For the first time since the loss of his family in Thebes, Heracles has begun to feel something close to companionship again. He does not say much about it, but Abderus understands him in a way that few others ever have. When they arrive at the coast of Thrace, Heracles leaves the bulk of his party in a safe camp and approaches the stables of Diomedes himself with only a small advance group. The plan is to free the horses under cover of night, drive them down to the ships, and sail home before the king realizes what has happened. The plan starts well. Heracles finds the iron-walled stable, breaks the heavy chains with his bare hands, and leads the 4 mares out one by one. They are even larger and more terrible than the legend suggested, with bloodied teeth and eyes that roll wildly in their massive heads. He hands the reins to Abderus, telling the young man to keep them at the edge of the field, while he turns to deal with the alarm now spreading through the palace. Diomedes himself, hearing the commotion, comes thundering out with his soldiers. The fight that follows is short and decisive. Heracles fights through the palace guard, makes his way to the king himself, and after a brief struggle subdues him. He drags Diomedes back toward the stables, intending to take the king prisoner and present him to Eurystheus along with the horses. But when Heracles returns to the field, he finds that Abderus is gone. The young man, alone with 4 flesh-eating mares far stronger than he could ever hope to control, has been unable to hold them. The horses have done what horses of that kind do, and Heracles arrives only in time to find the consequences. His friend, his bright young companion, is lost. He stands there for a long time. The mares have already had their fill and are quieter now, watching him from the shadows of the field. He does not cry, not the way ordinary men cry. He simply stands in the dark with his hands open at his sides, and the silence around him is as deep and as terrible as the silence that had filled his home in Thebes years before. He has lost again. He has loved someone, and that someone is gone, and once more the loss has happened on his watch. He does not speak for a long while. When he finally moves, it is to turn toward Diomedes, whom he had bound and dragged from the palace. The king, when he sees the look on Heracles' face, begins to plead. The pleading does not last very long. According to the myth, Heracles feeds Diomedes to his own horses, a justice so dark and so symmetrical that even the cruel king cannot argue with the logic of it. The 4 mares, having now eaten the man who taught them their terrible appetite, are forever changed by the meal. Some ancient sources say they were simply sated. Others say that something deeper happened in them, that the act of devouring their own master broke whatever divine curse had been laid on their wild hunger. Either way, when Heracles next approached them, They let him take their reins without struggle. The taste for human flesh was gone. They had become in essence ordinary horses again, large and powerful but no longer monsters. Heracles founds a city at the place where his friend died, naming it Abdera in his honour, and establishes funeral games there to be held in his memory. The games will continue in that city for centuries afterward, long after Heracles himself has passed into legend, a small, quiet tribute to a young man who would otherwise have been forgotten by history. The detail of the founding is worth lingering on for a moment, because it tells you something important about Heracles that the stories rarely state directly. He could have walked away. He had no obligation to build anything. Eurystheus had not asked him to commemorate the dead. The labours did not require him to leave a mark beyond delivering whatever beast he was sent for. But over and over, in his journey through the ancient world, Heracles paused to build things, name things, plant olive trees, dig wells, and dedicate altars. He left behind cities along his routes, shrines in the fields he'd walked through, springs at the places where he had rested. The pattern of his life was not destruction. It was, oddly, construction wrapped around the necessity of fighting monsters. He was, in his quiet way, the first hero in Greek myth who tried to leave the world better than he found it. The hero then leads the now docile mares back to Mycenae, where Eurystheus, predictably, refuses to keep them and orders them released into the mountains. Some say they were eventually killed by wild beasts. Others say they wandered off and lived out long, peaceful lives in the highlands of Olympus itself, having earned their rest in the strangest way imaginable. Either way, they trouble the world no more. Heracles walks back into Mycenae quieter than before. 8 labours are now done, although, as he's reminded again, only 6 of them count by Eurystheus's accounting. There are 6 more to go, plus the 2 replacement labours for the ones disqualified. The road is still long, and the cost of walking it is no longer measured only in monsters defeated. It is also measured in friends buried, in cities founded out of grief, in the quiet calculus of a man who keeps moving forward because stopping is no longer an option. Something has begun to change in him, although he himself cannot quite name it. He is no longer simply the broken hero who left Mycenae years ago, head down, willing to accept any punishment. He has become something stranger. He has become a man with purpose, even if the purpose is not the one he chose for himself. The monsters he kills are real monsters. The peoples he helps are real peoples. Whatever Eurystheus had intended these labours to be, they are now something else in practice. They are the slow, deliberate cleaning of the ancient world, valley by valley and kingdom by kingdom, one impossible task at a time. The injustice of his punishment has not disappeared, but it has been transformed somehow into a kind of usefulness. The hands that had once destroyed everything he loved are now, year by year, being put to work building things that will outlast him. Somewhere ahead, across the wide sea, in lands no Greek has ever seen, the rest of his trials are waiting. The 9th labour begins, as so many of the most complicated things in history have begun, with a young woman wanting something she cannot have. Eurystheus has a daughter named Admete, who has reached the age where teenage princesses around the ancient world tend to develop very specific demands. In her case, the demand is unusual. She has heard, through the gossip networks that connect the royal courts of Greece, about a particular piece of jewellery worn by Hippolyta, queen of the Amazons. It is a belt, sometimes described in older sources as a sash or a war girdle, depending on which storyteller is telling the tale. It was given to Hippolyta personally by the god of war Ares, who is of course her father. The belt is the symbol of her authority, the mark of her rank as the chosen queen of the warrior women, and it has never been worn by anyone but her in living memory. Admete wants it. She does not really know why. She has, in the way teenagers sometimes do, simply decided that she will not be happy until she has this one specific thing, and she has been working on her father for weeks. Eurystheus, who can refuse his daughter nothing, eventually relents. He calls Capreus the herald and instructs him to assign the next labour to Heracles. The hero must travel to the distant land of the Amazons, somewhere on the southern shores of the Black Sea, and bring back the legendary belt of Queen Hippolyta. The king takes a private comfort in this assignment. The Amazons are famous warriors, said to fight better than any army of men, and they are not known for being friendly to male visitors. Sending Heracles into their territory feels to Eurystheus like sending him into a beehive with a teaspoon and asking him to come back with the queen bee's tiara. The odds, in other words, look genuinely terrible. Heracles assembles a small crew for the journey. The Amazons live far to the east, across long stretches of unfamiliar sea, and this is not a trip one undertakes alone. He gathers several of the greatest heroes of his generation, men whose names would also become legends in their own rights. There is Theseus, the future king of Athens, still young and untested. There is Telamon, who will eventually father the great Ajax of the Trojan War. There is Peleus, who will marry a goddess and father Achilles himself. These are not minor companions. They are essentially the entire next generation of Greek heroes, all of them sharing a single ship with the most famous mortal of their time. It must have been a strange voyage, all of those legends crowded together on one wooden deck, sharing salted fish and arguing about navigation. The journey across the Aegean and into the Black Sea takes weeks. They make landfall in several places along the way, each visit producing minor adventures that the storytellers would later spin into their own tales. They liberate a Trojan princess named Hesione from a sea monster sent by Poseidon, which earns them the lasting gratitude of her father, King Laomedon, until Laomedon refuses to pay the agreed reward and earns himself a future visit from a very irritated Hercules. The pattern is, by this point, almost a routine. Hercules helps a king, the king promises payment, the king does not pay, Hercules makes a mental note for later. The list of kings who would eventually receive return visits from him was growing into a small but distinguished collection. They fight off pirates near the islands of the Propontis. They survive storms. They explore unfamiliar coastlines. By the time they finally drop anchor in the harbour of Themyscira, the capital city of the Amazons, the crew is sunburned, exhausted, and not entirely sure what to expect. What they do not expect is to be welcomed. Queen Hippolyta herself comes down to the harbour with her honour guard, riding a tall white horse and dressed in armour polished to a mirror finish. She's not what most Greeks imagined when they thought of Amazon warriors. She's tall, certainly, and her bearing is unmistakably that of a queen who has fought in many battles. But she's also calm, curious, and unexpectedly warm. She's heard, through the long network of myths and rumours that travel between distant lands, the story of Heracles. She knows about the labours, she knows about the lion and the hydra, and the long pursuit of the sacred deer. She is, by the time he steps off the ship, already half convinced that the man in front of her deserves her respect rather than her hostility. The Amazons, it turns out, are not the savage man-haters that Greek mythology often paints them as. They are a sophisticated society of warrior women, with their own laws, their own diplomatic relationships, their own arts and music. They simply do not allow men to live among them as equals, which is a different thing entirely from being unwilling to receive male guests with appropriate ceremony. Hippolyta invites Heracles and his crew into her palace. A feast is prepared. Long tables are laid out under the open sky, decorated with flowers and the kind of fine pottery that the Amazons made for visiting dignitaries. The Greeks, who had spent weeks at sea expecting an ambush, find themselves seated in the place of honour, being asked polite questions about their journey by the queen herself. Theseus, the future king of Athens, makes a particular impression on the Amazons. He is younger than Heracles, charming, and clearly a man with a great future ahead of him. He spends much of the evening in conversation with one of the queen's sisters, a princess named Antiope. Their friendship that night will, much later, develop into a story all its own, one that will eventually lead to Theseus carrying Antiope back to Athens as his wife, and triggering an entire Amazon invasion of Greece in retaliation. But that is years away. On this particular evening, in the warm torchlight of the Amazon palace, it is only the beginning of a friendship, and no one in the room has any idea where it will eventually lead. Heracles, who has spent years now being treated like either a danger or a tool, is genuinely moved by the welcome. He tells Hippolyta about the labours. He does not embellish. He does not boast. He simply tells the truth, the way he had once told it to Artemis on a forest path. He explains the curse, the death of his family, the unfair conditions of his service, the disqualified victories. He tells her about Abderus, about Pholus, about the friends he has lost along the way. The queen listens, and as she listens, something shifts in her expression. She has been a warrior all her life. She knows what it looks like when a brave person carries a weight that is heavier than they will admit. By the time Heracles has finished speaking, she has already made up her mind about what she will do. When the meal is over, Hippolyta stands up at the head of the table. She unbuckles the belt at her waist, the one given to her by her father, the symbol of her authority. She walks over to where Heracles is sitting, and in front of her entire court, hands it to him with both hands. She tells him that no man has ever earned a gift from her, but that he is not, in her judgment, like other men. She tells him that the belt is given freely, with her blessing, and that he should return to Mycenae with honour. The Amazons in the hall murmur among themselves. Some are surprised, some are quietly impressed, none of them object. The decision is the Queen's to make, and she has made it. It should have ended there, it really should have. But somewhere on Mount Olympus, Hera is watching, and she has not finished with Heracles yet. The sight of her hated stepson being treated with such grace, succeeding at yet another labour without losing a single drop of blood, fills her with a fury she has not felt since the early years. She had hoped, this time, that the Amazons would simply tear him apart upon arrival. She had not planned for the Queen to like him. She had certainly not planned for the Queen to hand him the belt with a smile. The goddess decides, in her cold, careful way, that she will need to handle the situation personally. Hera descends to earth in disguise. She takes on the form of an Amazon warrior, indistinguishable from any of the others in the camp, and walks quietly among them. She moves from group to group, leaning close, whispering. The story she tells is short and devastating. She tells the warriors that Heracles has not come for the belt at all. The belt was a pretext, a cover for the real plot. He has come, she whispers, to kidnap their queen. The Greek ships in the harbour are not there to leave peacefully. They are there to carry Hippolyta away into slavery, to parade her through Mycenae as a trophy, to humiliate the Amazons by stealing their leader. The men at the feast, she tells them, are not guests. They are an advance party. The real attack will come any moment. The Amazons are loyal to their queen above all things. The rumour spreads through the camp like fire through dry grass. Within an hour, women who had been laughing and trading songs with the Greek sailors are reaching for their weapons. Within 2 hours, the warriors are arming themselves with grim faces. Hippolyta, still inside the palace finishing her conversation with Heracles, hears nothing of what is happening outside. The rumour never reaches her. Hera makes sure of that. The genius of the trick, if you can call something so cruel a genius, lies in its precision. A single voice in the right ears at the right time. No drama, no thunder from the sky. Just a rumour, planted carefully, allowed to do its work the way weeds do their work in a garden no one is watching. What follows is one of the saddest battles in Greek mythology, because both sides believed they were defending themselves. The Amazons rowed down to the harbour to defend their queen from a kidnapping that was never going to happen. The Greeks looked up from their ships to see what looked like a sudden, unprovoked attack and reached for their own weapons, believing that the hospitality had been a trap from the beginning. Heracles himself, who had just been handed the belt willingly, ran out of the palace to find his crew under attack from the very people who had been welcoming them an hour before. He drew his weapons, defending his men, and the misunderstanding became impossible to undo. Hippolyta rode into the battle late. Having finally heard the alarm, she saw the chaos at the harbour, the fighting on the docks, the Greek ships preparing to flee. She saw Heracles among the fighters, and she made a fatal mistake. She assumed, based on what was happening around her, that the man she had welcomed at her own table had betrayed her. She believed that he had taken the belt from her not as a gift but as a theft, that the entire visit had been a deception. She charged him with all the fury of a queen who feels she has been made a fool of in her own court. The fight between them was short. Heracles, who did not understand any better than she did what was actually happening, defended himself. He still did not know about Hera's interference. He had no way of knowing that the queen attacking him was, in her own mind, defending her people from him. She fell in the chaos, not from cruelty on his part, not from any desire to harm her, but in the desperate confusion of a battle he had not started and could not stop. By the time the fighting ended and the surviving Amazons retreated from the harbour, Hippolyta lay still on the ground, and the belt that was supposed to have been a peaceful exchange had become the cost of an innocent woman's life. Heracles stood over her for a long time. Eventually an old Amazon warrior, one who had been close enough to overhear the whispered rumours but had not believed them, came forward and told him the truth. There had been a strange woman moving through the camp. The story she had told, the way the whole misunderstanding had erupted out of nowhere. Heracles listened without expression. He had been a player in another god's game again, and the price had been paid by someone who did not deserve it. He thanked the old warrior. He arranged for Hippolyta to be returned to her people for proper burial, with honours and gifts and the kind of formal respect that the situation demanded. The remaining Amazons accepted his apology in silence. There was nothing else to say. The voyage home was quiet. The other heroes of the crew who had not lost what Heracles had lost did not press him for conversation. They sailed back across the Black Sea and through the Aegean, the belt of Hippolyta packed carefully in a chest at the bottom of the ship. Heracles did not look at it. He could not bear to. When they arrived in Mycenae, he delivered the belt to Capreus the herald with the same blank expression he had worn for most of the journey home. Admete, the young princess, received it with great delight and wore it to the palace ball the following week. She had no idea what it had cost. She probably would not have cared if she had known. Some objects in this world carry sorrows their new owners never feel. The story of Hippolyta would echo long after Heracles was gone. Later Greek writers would argue about what had really happened that day. Some softened the story, claiming Hippolyta survived and was reconciled with Heracles. Some made the tragedy more pointed, emphasizing the role of Hera in engineering the misunderstanding. The Amazons themselves, in the version preserved by later mythographers, would never quite forgive the Greeks. The conflict with their southern neighbours would simmer for generations, eventually leading to the Amazon invasion of Athens in the time of Theseus. The seeds of that future war had been planted that single afternoon in Themyscira, when a goddess in disguise had whispered exactly the right lie into exactly the wrong ears. Hera, by then, would already be looking for the next opportunity, the next disaster, the next way to twist a small moment into a longer disaster. She rarely ran out of patience. The 10th labour follows, and this one will take Heracles further from home than any human has ever travelled. He is to journey to the island of Erythea, far in the Western Ocean, beyond the known edge of the world. There, a giant named Geryon lives with his herd of magnificent red cattle. Geryon is not an ordinary giant. He has 3 bodies fused together at the waist, 3 sets of arms, 3 heads, and a temperament described by ancient sources as unfriendly. His herd is guarded by a 2-headed dog named Orthrus, the brother of the more famous Cerberus who guards the Underworld, and by a herdsman named Eurytion, who is himself the size of a small village. Heracles is to steal the cattle, defeat their guardians, and bring the entire herd back to Mycenae alive. The journey alone would have been considered impossible by any mortal of the time. The actual labour at the end of it was almost an afterthought. To reach Erythea, Heracles must cross the entire breadth of the known world. He travels west through Greece, then through the lands of northern Africa, then along the southern coast of what would much later be called Spain. The journey takes months. At one point, he passes through a region where the heat is so intense that he becomes furious with the sun itself. He looks up at the burning sky, draws his bow, and actually fires arrows at the sun. The image is one of the most magnificently human moments in all of Greek mythology. A mortal man, sweating and irritated, threatening the literal sun with archery. It should not have worked. By any reasonable theology, it absolutely should not have worked. The territory he was crossing, for context, was the southern edge of what the Greeks called Libya, which in their geography meant the entire continent of Africa west of Egypt. They knew very little about it. The interior was, to their minds, a vast empty stretch of fire and sand inhabited by strange peoples and stranger creatures. Heracles was, in effect, one of the first Greeks to actually walk through it, and what he found there largely confirmed every miserable suspicion the rest of his countrymen had. The sun was relentless. Water was scarce. The few villages he passed had been baked half empty by the heat, and the people there looked at him as if he had personally arranged the weather. It is not entirely surprising that, after several weeks of this, he eventually pointed his bow at the source of his troubles. The surprise is what happened next, but the sun god Helios, riding his chariot across the sky, looks down at this strange small figure pointing a bow at him from the desert below. He is, against all logic, charmed by the absurdity. Helios is not a god who deals with many mortals personally. He has very little practical involvement in human affairs. He spends most of his existence simply driving his chariot from east to west and back again, the way a postal worker drives a route without much fuss. But this particular human has clearly lost his patience, and there is something in Helios that admires the sheer cosmic audacity of it. The god descends partway from his chariot, asks Heracles what he wants, and listens patiently to the explanation of the labour. Then, in a gesture of generosity so strange that the myth itself struggles to explain it, Helios offers him a gift. The god owns a great golden cup. the same vessel he uses each night to sail across the dark ocean back to his starting point in the east, before beginning his daily journey again. He hands the cup to Hercules, telling him that it will carry him safely across the ocean to Erythea. Hercules thanks him properly, lowers the bow, and sets out to find a coast. Before he sails, however, he does one of the most lasting things he has ever done. He arrives at the narrow strait that separates the continent of Europe from the continent of Africa, the place where the Mediterranean Sea pours into the wider ocean beyond. There, at the edge of the known world, he sets up 2 enormous pillars of stone, one on each side of the strait. They mark the boundary, he decides, between civilization and the unknown, the Pillars of Hercules, the Greeks called them. To this day, the same strait is still bordered by the Rock of Gibraltar on the north and Jebel Musa on the south, and ancient cartographers used to draw the pillars on their maps as a warning to sailors. Beyond this line, the maps would say, there be dragons. For most of the ancient world, the pillars marked the actual edge of reality, the place where the world stopped being mapped and started being guessed at. It is worth pausing here to note something about the cultural impact of these pillars. They became, in time, far more than just a geographical landmark. They were used in royal heraldry, on coins, on flags. The Spanish Empire later adopted the Pillars of Hercules as part of its national symbol, and some historians have argued that the modern dollar sign itself is descended from a stylized image of the pillars with a ribbon wrapped around them. Whether or not that particular etymology is true, the pillars endured. A single afternoon's work by an exhausted hero on his way to fight a 3-headed giant became one of the longest-lasting branding exercises in human history. He probably did not realize it at the time. He probably just wanted to mark the spot before continuing. Hercules, of course, sails past them in a golden cup the size of a small boat, which is the kind of detail that suggests he was not especially worried about the warning. The voyage across the open ocean to Erythea takes several days. The cup, propelled by some divine current that no one has ever been able to explain, carries him smoothly through waves that should have been impossible. He arrives on the island in the early morning, drags the cup up onto the beach and begins walking inland. The first guardian he encounters is the 2-headed dog Orthrus. The animal is the size of a horse, with 2 snarling heads on a single muscular body. It launches itself at Hercules with both sets of jaws open. The fight is brief. The hero, who has by now developed a kind of weary efficiency with monsters, ends the encounter with a single swing of his great club and continues on his way. The herdsman Eurytion arrives next, charging across the field with a tree trunk club of his own, and is dispatched almost as quickly. Neither of them, frankly, was the real challenge. The real challenge is Geryon himself, who has been alerted by the commotion and is now bearing down on Hercules across the wide plain where his cattle graze. The 3-bodied giant is a strange and terrible sight. 3 torsos, all attached at a single set of hips, all armed with separate swords and shields. 3 heads roaring different battle cries at the same time. It is the kind of opponent that no normal warrior could possibly handle. The shields move in 3 different directions to block whatever attack is coming. The swords swing from 3 different angles at once. There is no opening, no obvious weakness. No place to strike that is not already defended by another arm and another eye. Hercules, who has not survived this long by being predictable, decides to skip the sword fight entirely. He reaches over his shoulder, pulls out his bow, and fires a single hydra-poisoned arrow at Geryon from a distance. The arrow does not need to penetrate any particular vital spot. Hydra venom does not require precision, it needs only to touch flesh. The arrow passes through the air, finds its mark, and the poison begins to spread through all 3 bodies at once. The giant falls in the field, 3 pairs of arms still grasping at swords they will never swing again. The cattle, who have been watching this whole encounter with the placid curiosity of cows everywhere, continue to chew their grass. It is perhaps the most efficient defeat of any of the labours. The lion had taken hours. The hydra had taken most of a day. Geryon, with his 3 bodies and overwhelming combat advantages, lasted approximately as long as it took an arrow to travel from a bowstring to a chest. Hercules had learned, over the years of his service, that strength alone was never enough. The Augean stables had taught him the value of indirect solutions. The Stymphalian birds had taught him the value of an unexpected sound. Geryon, in his way, taught him the value of not letting your opponent dictate the terms of the fight. The giant had 3 sets of arms and 3 faces, all of them designed for close combat. He had no defence against an enemy who simply chose not to come within reach. The lesson, applied 1,000 times since by every general who ever fought a stronger foe, was that the most dangerous warrior is not the one with the biggest sword. It is the one who refuses to fight on your terms. Heracles drives the entire red herd down to the beach, loads them somehow onto the golden cup, and begins the long sail home. The return journey is even longer than the one out. He has to cross the open ocean, sail back through the pillars he just erected, travel the entire length of the Mediterranean again, and then drive the cattle overland through several kingdoms to reach Mycenae. Along the way, Hera makes one final attempt to stop him. She sends a gadfly to harass the cattle, scattering them across vast distances. Heracles has to chase them through wild country, gathering them up one by one, which adds months to a journey that was already absurdly long. He encounters bandits along the way, including a particularly persistent thief named Cacus, in a cave near what would much later become the city of Rome. Cacus tries to steal several of the cattle by dragging them backwards into his hideout, so the hoofprints would point the wrong way. It was a clever trick, the kind of thing that probably worked on most travellers passing through the area. Heracles, however, noticed almost immediately when he sat down to count his herd and found several missing. He spent a few moments examining the ground around the camp, observed that all the visible hoofprints led away from a particular cave, and concluded that no group of cattle had ever in the history of grazing walked backwards into a cave for the night. He dealt with the matter quietly. The locals of the region, who had been suffering under Cacus for years, were grateful enough that they later built shrines to Heracles in the area. Some sources say this was the very beginning of his worship in Italy, long before Rome itself was founded. The story would become important again, centuries later, when Roman storytellers wanted a heroic origin for their own city. By the time he finally drives the surviving cattle through the gates of Mycenae, more than a year has passed since he set out. He is tanned, lean, exhausted, and carrying the kind of road weariness that no amount of sleep can really fix. He delivers the cattle to Eurystheus, who promptly sacrifices most of them to Hera, presumably to stay on her good side. Heracles, watching from across the courtyard, does not protest. He has done what he was asked to do. The labour is complete, or it should have been complete. But Eurystheus that morning has been doing some bookkeeping. He has been counting carefully. By his own accounting, 2 of the labours so far have been disqualified, the Hydra for the help of Aeolus, and the Augean stables for the matter of payment. That leaves Heracles, by Eurystheus's count, at only 8 valid labours completed. He still owes 4 more, not 2. 4. It is one of the meanest moments in the entire saga, made even more cruel by how casually it is delivered. Heracles has just returned from a journey that took him further than any Greek had ever gone. He is dusty, sunburned, and quietly grieving. He has watched a queen die in a battle she should never have fought. He has crossed an ocean in a divine cup. He has walked back across half the world driving a herd of cattle through bandit country. And the news that greets him in his cousin's palace is essentially that the math has been reviewed and he still owes more work. There is no ceremony. There is no acknowledgement of what he has just accomplished. There is only the herald perched on the parapet, reading out numbers from a scroll like a clerk announcing a tax bill. Heracles stands in the courtyard and listens as the herald announces this ruling. He has now travelled to the edge of the world and back. He has fought a 3-bodied giant. He has lost a friend, killed an innocent queen, sailed in a golden cup across an ocean no Greek had ever crossed. And the count, the careful arithmetic of the king, who has spent the last decade trying to bury him in impossible tasks, has just been adjusted to extend his service by 2 more labours. He does not speak. He does not protest. He has long since accepted that arguing with Eurystheus is pointless. He simply nods once and waits for the next assignment. Up on Olympus, Hera permits herself a small, cold smile. She is running out of monsters. She has used most of the truly terrible creatures of the known world already. But she has 2 more in mind. They are the worst of them all. They will require Heracles to leave not only the mortal world, but the world of the living entirely. If she cannot kill him with monsters of the earth, she will see if she can kill him with monsters from beyond it. The next 2 labours, she decides, will take him to places no mortal has ever returned from, and she is not entirely confident even now that he will survive them, but she is hopeful. She has always been hopeful. The other Olympians by this point have begun to take quiet sides. Athena, who had given him the bronze rattles for the Stymphalian birds, watches every labour now with a kind of calm pride. Hermes, who had carried the infant Hercules up to Hera's chest all those years ago, finds himself increasingly amused by the way his half-brother keeps outsmarting his stepmother. Even Apollo, who had originally delivered the prophecy that sent Heracles into service, has begun to suspect that this particular punishment may not be turning out the way Hera intended. The gods are not unanimous in their feelings about him. Some still want him to fail, some now want him to win. The disagreement in time would have consequences none of them could quite predict. The road ahead is darker than any of the roads behind him, and Heracles, who has spent the better part of his adult life walking those darker roads, simply tightens the strap of his lion-skin cloak, picks up his club, and waits to hear what comes next. The 11th labour begins with a question that no mortal has ever been able to answer. Where, exactly, is the garden of the Hesperides? Eurystheus delivers the task in his usual way, shouted from a safe distance by Copreus the herald. Heracles must find the legendary garden at the edge of the world, pluck 3 golden apples from a tree planted there by the goddess Gaia herself, and bring them back to Mycenae. Simple instructions, impossible execution. Because the location of the garden is a secret known only to a handful of beings in the universe, and none of them happen to live anywhere near Greece. The apples themselves are the most precious objects in all of mythology. They were a wedding gift from Gaia, the primordial earth goddess, to Hera when she married Zeus, and the goddess has guarded them jealously ever since. The tree on which they grow is tended by 3 nymphs called the Hesperides, daughters of either the night or the evening, depending on which storyteller is doing the explaining. Around the base of the tree, coiled in a permanent state of vigilance, lies a serpent called Ladon, who has, depending on the source, anywhere from 1 to 100 heads. Most of the older versions settle on the more dramatic count, because mythology has never been a discipline that rewards understatement. Heracles does not know where the garden is. He does not know any mortal who knows. He sets out west from Mycenae with no real plan beyond the vague understanding that the garden is somewhere at the far edge of the world, and that he will need to ask a great many people along the way. What follows is one of the longest and strangest journeys in his entire saga, partly because no one he meets seems to agree on the basic geography. Some tell him the garden lies in the far west, beyond the pillars he had erected during the previous labour. Some tell him it lies in the far north, in a land of perpetual twilight where the stars never set. Some tell him it lies in the far south, deep in the unmapped continents below Egypt. The most helpful response he gets, after months of asking, is a polite suggestion that he ask someone else. It is during this aimless wandering that he begins picking up a curious assortment of smaller adventures, the kind that the storytellers would later spend whole evenings on, but which barely register in the main story. He travels through Illyria, where he wrestles a strange shape-shifting sea god named Nereus, the old man of the sea, in order to extract directions from him. Nereus, in the manner of all sea gods, refuses to answer questions while being asked nicely, and only becomes informative when physically restrained. He turns into a fish. Heracles holds on. He turns into a serpent. Heracles holds on. He turns into water, into fire, into a dozen impossible forms, and each time the hero simply refuses to let go. It is, when you think about it, an excellent metaphor for how Heracles approached every problem in his life. Eventually Nereus, exhausted and impressed, agrees to answer the question. He tells Heracles to seek out the Titan Prometheus, who can give him better directions than any sea god. Then he gives the hero an exact route, slumps back into the waves, and sinks below the surface to recover his dignity in private. There is a particular kind of charm in the way Greek mythology handles divine information. The gods, for the most part, knew everything that was happening in the world. They could simply have told mortals what they wanted to know whenever asked. They almost never did. Instead, they made you earn the answer, whether through wrestling matches, riddles, prophecies hidden in vague language, or quests for some intermediate object that would unlock the next clue. It was, in effect, the longest customer service queue ever invented. Heracles had been navigating this queue for most of his adult life by now. He had grown rather good at it. He had learned that the only reliable way to get a sea god to talk was to refuse to release them no matter what shape they took. The only reliable way to get a prophecy out of an oracle was to keep asking variations of the same question until something useful slipped out, and the only reliable way to get directions from a wise being was to do them a favour large enough to make refusal awkward. He filed Nereus's advice carefully and turned east toward the Caucasus Mountains. The detour to find Prometheus takes Hercules deep into the Caucasus Mountains, far to the east of Greece, in a region of jagged peaks and bitter cold. Prometheus, the reader may recall, was the Titan who once stole fire from the gods and gave it to humanity, an act of generosity that Zeus had punished with the kind of imagination that only an angry king of the gods can muster. The Titan had been chained to a cliffside in these mountains, naked and exposed, with an enormous eagle sent each day to torment his immortal body. Because Prometheus could not die, the punishment was permanent. The eagle came every day. Each night the wounds healed. Each morning the eagle returned to begin again. By the time Heracles arrives, Prometheus has been enduring this for centuries, possibly millennia, depending on which version of the story you're reading. To Greek audiences listening to this story by firelight, the Prometheus figure was not just a Titan being punished. He was, in a real sense, the patron of human civilization itself. Without him, there would have been no fire. Without fire, there would have been no cooked food, no metalworking, no pottery, no glassmaking, no warmth in winter, no light at night, no civilization of any kind. Every comfort the audience enjoyed while listening to the story had been bought, in a sense, by the suffering of the figure now chained to the cliff. To free him was not just an act of compassion, it was an act of repayment. Heracles, as he climbed the mountain, may not have consciously thought of it in those terms, but the story itself, in every retelling, would emphasize this particular point. The hero was about to settle a debt that all of humanity owed. Heracles climbs the mountain with the lion-skin cloak pulled tight against the cold. The wind in these peaks is unlike anything he has felt in Greece, sharp and dry, smelling of nothing but stone. When he finally reaches the cliffside where the Titan is chained, he finds Prometheus exactly as the stories had described. The great fire-giver, gaunt and weathered but unbroken in spirit, looks down at the visitor with eyes that have seen everything mortal and most things divine. He recognizes Heracles immediately. He has, after all, been a prophet as well as a fire thief in his other career, and he has known for a long time that the son of Zeus would eventually arrive at this cliff. Heracles does not ask questions first. He looks up at the chained Titan, sees the great eagle circling lazily in the sky above, and makes the decision that defines this part of the labour. He raises his bow. He fits one of his hydra-poisoned arrows to the string. He aims at the eagle, which has spent generations performing its daily torment unchallenged, and he releases. The arrow flies true. The eagle falls from the sky and disappears into the rocks below. The bird is dead before it lands, and centuries of punishment end in a single second. The Titan watches all of this happen with an expression that is hard to read. Then he speaks, for the first time in a very long time, to anyone other than the eagle. He tells Heracles that he is grateful, but that the chains themselves are also a problem, having been forged by Hephaestus to hold him for eternity. Heracles examines the chains. He puts his hands on them. He braces his feet against the cliffside, and he simply, slowly, methodically pulls. The chains, which were never designed to resist the strength of a demigod with a personal mission, begin to creak. They groan, they strain, and then, with a sound like the crack of a divine bone, they snap. Prometheus stumbles forward, free for the first time in longer than he can remember, and falls to his knees on the snowy rock. This is the moment that begins one of the strangest political situations in Greek mythology. Zeus had sworn that Prometheus would never be freed from the cliff. Heracles has just freed him. By the technical rules of divine oaths, this should be an enormous problem. The way the gods eventually solved it was clever in the way that legal systems are clever. They agreed that Prometheus must always wear a fragment of the rock he'd been chained to, and a piece of the iron chain set into a ring on his finger. As long as he wore the ring, he was technically still bound to the rock. Honour was preserved. Everyone involved pretended not to notice the obvious workaround. It is, frankly, the kind of solution that probably inspired every diplomatic compromise in the centuries since. Prometheus, once freed, repays the favour immediately. He sits down with Heracles on the cold stone and gives him the only useful advice he's going to receive about the garden of the Hesperides. The hero must not, under any circumstances, try to pick the apples himself. The serpent Ladon would simply kill him. The Hesperides themselves, if they sensed an intruder, would call for divine help that Hercules could not match. The only being in the universe who could safely approach the tree was Atlas, the Titan condemned to hold up the sky at the western edge of the world. Atlas was, after all, the father of the Hesperides. The serpent would let him pass. The nymphs would not raise the alarm. He could simply walk in, pick the apples, and walk out, the way one might collect fruit from a friendly neighbour's tree. The catch, Prometheus warns him with a small, bitter smile, is that Atlas is currently occupied. He has been holding up the sky since the end of the Great War between the Titans and the Olympian gods, a punishment that has lasted nearly as long as the punishment Prometheus himself had just escaped. Atlas cannot simply walk away to fetch apples for a passing hero. Someone, or something, would have to take his place for as long as he was gone. Prometheus does not say what Heracles is going to need to do. He does not have to. The hero, who has been listening carefully, has already worked out the implications. He thanks Prometheus, helps the Titan down the mountain to begin his long, free walk home, and turns west toward the edge of the world. The journey to the western horizon takes weeks. Heracles travels back across northern Africa, back past the pillars he had set up during the previous labour, and out into the wild, empty lands beyond. Here the geography becomes uncertain. The maps, even in his head, stop being maps and start being guesses. He walks across dry plateaus and through forests no Greek has ever named. He passes lakes the colour of rust and rivers that flow toward the sunset rather than the sea. He meets, along the way, a number of strange beings whose names get mentioned briefly in the older stories and never again. There is a giant named Antaeus, the son of Gaia, who challenges every traveller to a wrestling match and has never been defeated. The trick, Heracles eventually realises, is that Antaeus draws his strength from contact with the earth, his mother. The hero solves the problem by lifting Antaeus into the air, where the giant becomes ordinary, and ending the match with him properly disconnected from the ground. The Antaeus encounter became one of the most quoted passages in later writings about the labour, particularly during the Renaissance, when European painters and poets returned to the story repeatedly. The image of a hero lifting an enemy off the ground to weaken them was used as a metaphor for everything from political reform to religious philosophy. The lesson, depending on the interpreter, was either about the importance of staying grounded or the danger of relying too heavily on a single source of strength. Heracles himself probably did not think about it that deeply at the time. He had a giant to defeat. He noticed that the giant got stronger when he touched the ground. He lifted the giant. Sometimes the simplest observations make for the best stories. There is a king named Busiris in Egypt who tries to sacrifice Heracles to the gods, a plan that ends about as well as any plan to sacrifice the strongest man in the world tends to end. There is even a brief visit to the land of the Hyperboreans, the legendary people who live in eternal spring beyond the north wind, where Heracles is welcomed as an honoured guest and rests for several days before continuing west. The Hyperboreans, in the Greek imagination, were essentially the perfect human society. They had no war, no disease, no famine, no aging beyond a graceful and gentle decline. They lived in groves of trees that never lost their leaves, ate food that never ran out, and worshipped the gods without ever feeling burdened by them. Heracles stayed with them only briefly. He found their peace beautiful, in the abstract, but unbearable in practice. He had spent too many years carrying difficult things to know how to put them down even for a week. He thanked his host politely and moved on, and the Hyperboreans, who understood many things, watched him go without trying to convince him to stay. Eventually he comes to a place where the land ends, not in the way coastlines end, where there is sea and then the implication of more land beyond. This is a different kind of ending. The ground simply stops, and beyond it stretches the wide, dark ocean that the Greeks called Okeanos, the world river that encircled the known world like a vast moat. Standing at the very edge of this ending, his back to the rising sun, is the largest figure Heracles has ever seen. Atlas. The Titan is enormous, taller than any mountain Heracles has ever climbed. His shoulders bowed under a weight that is invisible to most mortal eyes, but perfectly obvious to anyone with even a small piece of divine blood. Above him, balanced on those impossibly broad shoulders, is the entire sky. Not the air, not the atmosphere. The actual celestial dome, the wheeling vault of stars and constellations and the regular movements of all the heavenly bodies, resting on a single being's back like the lid of an enormous bowl. It is one of the strangest images in all of mythology, and one of the most awe-inspiring. The Greeks did not, in their cosmology, picture the sky as empty space. They pictured it as a solid sphere, a celestial machine made of crystal and turning slowly above the flat disk of the Earth. Someone had to hold it in place. After the great cosmic war, that someone became Atlas, who had picked the wrong side and been given the consolation prize of holding up reality itself for the rest of eternity. He had been doing the job by the time Hercules arrived, for so long that his body had begun to look more like a landscape than a person. His muscles had become slow and ridged like geology. His skin had taken on the texture of weathered stone. His face was set in an expression of permanent, exhausted concentration. He did not blink as often as a mortal would have. He could not afford to. The geography around him reflected his presence in subtle ways. The plants that grew at his feet were short and tough, the kind of vegetation that thrives in the constant shadow of something enormous. The animals in the area had developed a quiet, careful manner of movement, as if they had inherited a permanent sense of being slightly underneath something. Even the wind here behaved differently, swirling in slow circles around the Titan's legs before sweeping out toward the ocean. In the older versions of the myth, the entire region was simply known as the Atlas country, and the Great Atlas Mountains in modern Morocco are still named after this figure, the petrified or geographic remains of the Titan's body in one version of the legend. Travellers passing through the region in later centuries would point at the highest peaks and tell their children that those were his shoulders, those were his arms, those were the parts of him that had eventually turned to stone under the unending weight. Heracles approached him slowly, the way one might approach a sleeping giant or a tired old soldier. He greeted the Titan respectfully. He explained who he was, why he had come, and what he needed. He did not waste time on flattery. He simply asked plainly whether Atlas might be willing to pick 3 apples from the garden of the Hesperides, while someone, perhaps Heracles himself, held the sky in his absence. Atlas considered the proposal in silence for what felt like a very long time. The wind moved around him slowly, the way wind sometimes does around very large things. Eventually he said, in a voice like grinding stones, that he would do it. He had not left his post in longer than he could remember. The chance to walk away from the burden, even briefly, was almost more than he could resist. He was, in his way, eager. He gave Heracles a single instruction. Stand here, exactly here, and brace yourself. The sky is heavier than you expect. Heracles did not really understand what he was about to feel. He had braced for impossible weights before. He had wrestled the Nemean Lion. He had carried the Erymanthian boar across mountains. He had held off a tide of attacking centaurs and a charging Cretan bull. He had even held the weight of the entire surviving cattle herd of Geryon stable in a small golden boat on a stormy sea. He was by any normal definition the strongest mortal in history. He believed he could handle whatever Atlas was about to hand him. He could not have been more wrong. The moment Atlas transferred the sky onto Heracles' shoulders, the hero understood what nothing in his entire life had prepared him for. The weight was not, as he had expected, just enormous. It was not even merely crushing. It was in some deep and indescribable sense infinite. The sky did not simply press down on him. It pressed in on him. Every star above weighed something. Every constellation contributed its share. The wheeling movement of the heavens was not a passive thing. It was a continuous motion that had to be borne and adjusted for, the way one might balance a tray of water while walking. He had to keep the sky from tilting. He had to keep it from slipping sideways. He had to compensate for the cosmic spin of the entire celestial sphere with the muscles of his own back and legs and arms. The first minute was the worst. His knees buckled. He nearly went down. According to the legend, the goddess Athena herself appeared at this moment and helped to steady the load on his shoulders, the way one might brace a friend who is lifting too much. With her divine help, Heracles managed to plant his feet, to find the right stance, to discover the way to brace himself against the impossible weight without collapsing. After that initial crisis, the labour settled into a different kind of suffering, less acute, more endless. Every muscle in his body burned. Every breath felt thin because the sky pressed down on his ribs and made expansion difficult. Every minute felt like an hour. Every hour felt like a year. And Atlas, meanwhile, walked away. The Titan, freed of his burden for the first time in epochs, set off across the sky toward the garden of the Hesperides with an almost cheerful tread. The Hesperides were his daughters. They greeted him with delight when he arrived. The serpent Ladon, recognizing him as family, simply lifted its many heads in acknowledgement and went back to its watchful coil. Atlas plucked 3 of the golden apples from the great tree, exchanged a few warm words with his daughters, and turned to walk back to the edge of the world. The errand had taken him perhaps the better part of a single day. When Atlas returned to the place where Hercules was waiting, still bearing the sky, the Titan paused. He looked at the hero. He looked at the burden on the hero's shoulders. He held the golden apples in his enormous hand, and he had in that moment the kind of thought that any being who has been doing the same terrible job for 10,000 years would inevitably have. He could simply not take the sky back. He could walk away. Heracles was strong after all. Heracles seemed to be managing the load. Atlas could leave the sky on the hero's shoulders, take the apples to Mycenae himself, claim the labour as completed, and be free for the first time in millennia. He could see his children whenever he wished. He could lie down. He could sleep. He could do all of the small mortal things he had not done in the entire history of his punishment. The temptation was, by any honest measure, almost overwhelming. He told Heracles very casually that he had been thinking about the situation. He suggested that perhaps the hero might consider holding the sky just a little while longer. He himself, Atlas explained, would happily deliver the apples to Eurystheus. It was no trouble. He knew the way. Heracles could rest here by the edge of the world, while Atlas took care of the final delivery. The Titan tried to make the offer sound generous, the way someone offering to do you a favour would sound. He even smiled, the first time he had smiled in centuries. It was a strange and unsettling expression, on a face that had not used those muscles in a very long time. Heracles understood instantly what was happening. He did not panic. He did not protest. He did not, as some weaker hero might have done, accuse Atlas of betrayal. Instead, he did one of the cleverest things he ever did in his entire life. He smiled back. He told Atlas that the plan sounded reasonable. The apples did need to be delivered after all, and Atlas certainly knew the route better than he did. But there was one small problem. The sky was, as Atlas had warned him, much heavier than expected, and Heracles had not had time to adjust his stance properly when first taking it. His cloak was bunched up around his shoulders in a way that was making the load unbalanced. If Atlas would not mind taking the sky back for just 1 minute, just long enough for Heracles to fold his lion skin into a proper pad for his shoulders, then he could resume the burden in a more comfortable position, and the Titan could go on his way. Atlas, who had spent the last several centuries being miserable and physically rigid, did not stop to consider the implications of this request. He was eager to be done with the negotiation. He set down the apples carefully on the ground. He turned around. He bent his great shoulders back into the familiar position. And he allowed Heracles to slide the sky off his own back and onto the Titans once again. The moment the weight transferred, the moment Heracles was free, the deception ended. The hero picked up the 3 golden apples from the ground. He picked up his club. He bowed politely to Atlas, thanked him sincerely for his help, and turned to begin the long walk home. The Titan, realizing too late what had happened, called out after him. He shouted, he pleaded, he threatened. None of it had any effect because Atlas could not chase him. Atlas could not move. Atlas was, once again, exactly where the gods had put him, holding up the sky for the rest of eternity, watching the figure of Heracles grow smaller and smaller across the endless western plain. It is, by any reasonable measure, the most satisfying moment in any of the labours. The strongest man in the world had been tricked, and he had tricked back, and the trickster had returned to his original sentence with a fresh new lesson about the value of honesty. Some sources suggest that Atlas accepted the loss with a kind of weary humour, conceding that he had been outmanoeuvred by his own greed. Other sources have him cursing Heracles for generations afterward. Either way, the Titan returned to his post and stayed there. He was still there when later Greek travellers reached the western edge of the world. He was still there when the Romans replaced the Greeks. He was still there in the dim, half-remembered geography of medieval maps. He is, presumably, still there now, in whichever cosmological corner the ancient Greeks really did believe their sky was being held up from. Heracles walked back across the world with 3 golden apples wrapped carefully in cloth. The journey home was easier than the journey out, partly because he now had a clear path to follow, and partly because his body, after the experience of bearing the sky, felt strangely light. After what he had just held, everything else in the natural world seemed weightless by comparison. He could carry boulders without noticing them. He could climb mountains without breathing hard. The labour had broken something in him, and also rebuilt it, and the man who walked back into Mycenae was no longer quite the same hero who had walked out months earlier. He had, in the most literal sense possible, learned what it meant to support the world. The lesson had marked him. When he arrived at the palace and delivered the apples to Eurystheus, the king was predictably terrified by them. The fruits were not ordinary fruits. They glowed faintly in his hand. They smelled of an orchard that did not exist anywhere on the mortal earth. The king did not know what to do with them. He could not eat them. He could not throw them away. Their very presence in his palace made him nervous, the way one becomes nervous around an object that obviously belongs to a god. After several days of agonizing, Eurystheus called Heracles back to the throne room, pressed the apples into the hero's hands, and told him to get rid of them. He did not want them in his city. He did not want them in his country. He did not frankly want them in his life. It is one of the small ironies of the entire labour that the prize, after everything, turned out to be unwanted. Princess Admeet had once demanded the belt of an Amazon queen for her ball gowns. Eurystheus had once demanded the golden apples of the Hesperides for reasons no one quite remembers. Both objects had been retrieved at enormous cost. Both objects ended up being returned. The hero had travelled to the ends of the world, fought monsters, freed titans, held up the sky, and the kingdom he served had no idea what to do with any of his trophies. It was, in its way, the most accurate summary of his entire service to Eurystheus. He was being made to do impossible things for a court that could not even appreciate what it was asking for. Heracles, who had crossed half the world to retrieve these objects, simply nodded. He took the apples outside, looked up at the bright Greek sky for a long moment, and offered them to the goddess Athena, who had helped him bear the weight when he could no longer bear it alone. Athena accepted them gracefully. She returned them quietly to the garden of the Hesperides, where they were placed back on the tree, and where they presumably hang to this day, still glowing in the perpetual twilight at the edge of the world, exactly where they had been before Heracles ever started his journey. The whole thing, in the end, had been about the journey rather than the apples. That was true of most of the labours, but it was especially true of this one. The strongest man alive had crossed the unknown world, freed a tortured titan, outwitted another, and held up the sky itself, all so that he could bring 3 pieces of fruit to a king who immediately wanted them gone. There is a kind of cosmic comedy in the arrangement. There is also a kind of cosmic dignity. The labour was complete, and that was what mattered. The terms had been met. The arithmetic of his punishment had been advanced by 1 more entry. There was, by Eurystheus's careful and unfair accounting, exactly 1 labour left, and that one, the 12th, would not take Heracles to the edge of the world. It would take him beneath it. The road ahead led downward now, into the only place he had not yet visited, the only realm even Hera had not been able to send him into until now, the kingdom of the dead, the realm of Hades, the lightless country from which no mortal had ever walked out alive. Heracles tightened his cloak 1 more time, took a long quiet breath, and waited to hear the final task. The 12th labour is announced from the parapet of the palace by Copreus the herald, and even he, who has spent the last decade calling out terrible assignments from a safe distance, seems unsettled as he speaks the words. Heracles is to descend into the Underworld, the kingdom of Hades, and bring back the great 3-headed dog Cerberus who guards the gates of the dead. He must do this without weapons of any kind. He must do this and return alive, which is something that no living mortal has ever managed to do in the long history of the world. The condition about the weapons is added almost as a courtesy, because Eurystheus is fairly certain that the rest of the assignment will handle the matter of survival on its own. There is no need for additional rules when the basic task is already understood to be lethal. The hero listens to the assignment in silence. He does not protest. He does not ask for clarification. He simply nods, turns, and walks out of the city. The road he takes leads south, toward the Cape of Tainaron at the southernmost tip of the Peloponnese, where, according to ancient tradition, one of the few mortal entrances to the underworld is hidden in a deep cave by the sea. He walks for days. He does not speak to anyone he meets along the way. The people of the villages he passes through recognize him by his lion-skin cloak and his great olive-wood club, and they whisper to each other after he is gone, telling their children that they had seen the famous Heracles on his way to do something terrible. none of them know exactly what. They can tell from the set of his shoulders that whatever it is, he believes he may not be coming back. There is a particular kind of stillness that settles over a man preparing to die. Heracles had carried it before, in the months after the loss of his family in Thebes, when he had walked the road to Delphi expecting nothing. He had not felt that stillness in years. The labours, for all their difficulty, had given him something to do. The road south to Tyneron was different. There was no monster waiting for him this time, no creature to outwit, no clever solution to be discovered. There was only a country no living being was supposed to enter, and the simple fact that he was about to walk into it. Before he attempts the descent, however, Heracles does something that the older versions of the myth emphasize and the newer ones sometimes leave out. He travels to the city of Eleusis near Athens and seeks initiation into the famous mysteries of Demeter. The Eleusinian mysteries were the most sacred rites in all of ancient Greece, secret ceremonies performed for those who wished to ensure a safe passage through the afterlife. The exact details of what happened during these rites were guarded for over 1,000 years, and most of them remain unknown even today. Heracles, however, did not undertake this initiation for the usual reasons. He needed it as a kind of spiritual passport. The divine permission required for any living mortal to cross safely into the realm of the dead and return. The priests of Eleusis were initially reluctant. Heracles had blood on his hands from many of his labours, blood that was supposed to disqualify him from the sacred rites. Eventually, a special ritual was arranged to purify him, and he was accepted as an initiate. He emerged from the ceremony quieter than he had entered. He had been shown things he was not allowed to tell anyone about, and he never did. He simply continued south, toward Tyneron, with the knowledge of the mysteries tucked carefully into the corner of his mind that he reserved for the things he could not speak about aloud. The mysteries themselves were one of the great institutions of the ancient world, observed continuously for nearly 2,000 years before they were finally suppressed by Christian emperors in the late 4th century. People from across the entire Greek-speaking world travelled to Eleusis to be initiated, including emperors, philosophers, poets, and ordinary farmers. The rites involved a procession from Athens, a series of sacred meals, the recitation of secret formulas, and, at the climactic moment, the revelation of some object or vision that was said to permanently change the initiate's relationship to death itself. Whatever was shown in that final moment, it inspired such profound experiences that men like Cicero and Plutarch wrote about it as the most important event of their lives while never quite explaining what had actually happened. The mysteries kept their secret for 2 millennia. They keep it still. Heracles, in his way, became part of that long silent tradition the moment he was admitted to the rites. He had been given keys he was not allowed to describe, and he carried them into the dark like a man carrying water through fire. The entrance at Tyneron is in a deep sea cave at the edge of a cliff. The water there is so dark that it seems to absorb the light around it. The air smells of cold stone and something else, something older, the way an abandoned well smells if you lean close to its mouth. Heracles descends into the cave with no torch, no lamp, no light of any kind. He has been told that the Underworld has its own dim illumination, a kind of grey twilight that never grows brighter and never quite fades to true darkness, and that mortal flame is not welcome there. He walks downward through the cave for what feels like hours, the path twisting deeper and deeper into the earth until the seawater behind him is far above, and he can no longer hear the waves. The walls of the tunnel grow smoother as he descends. The slope becomes more gradual, and eventually, without any clear moment of crossing, he realizes that the cave has ended, that he is walking through a wide-open landscape, and that this landscape is no longer part of the world above. He has arrived in the kingdom of the dead. It is not what he expected. The Greeks pictured the afterlife not as fire or punishment, but as something stranger, a vast underground country lit by a perpetual grey light that came from nowhere in particular. There were rivers down here. There were fields. There were even something like meadows full of pale flowers that did not quite resemble any flowers Heracles had ever seen above. The whole place felt, to his living senses, like a faded copy of the surface world, drained of colour and warmth but still recognisable in its basic shape. He could see distant hills. He could see what looked like the outlines of cities. He could see faintly the great gates somewhere far ahead, the gates he had come here to reach. He was not alone. The shades of the dead moved through the grey landscape, sometimes in slow processions, sometimes alone. Most of them did not seem to notice him. The dead, in the Greek understanding, were not really conscious in any way that mortals would recognize. They had drunk from the river Lethe and forgotten everything about their previous lives. They wandered the fields with empty expressions, neither happy nor sad, neither aware nor entirely absent. Heracles walked past them respectfully. He did not try to speak to them. He had been warned during the Eleusinian rites that the dead were not to be disturbed casually, and he kept his eyes forward. The guide who appeared to walk beside him was Hermes, the messenger god, in his role as the conductor of souls. Hermes did not announce himself with thunder or light. He simply fell into step next to Heracles one moment, when the hero looked over and noticed him there. The two had known each other since infancy, ever since Hermes had been the one to carry Heracles up to the sleeping hero for his fateful drink of divine milk. The relationship between them had always been friendly. Hermes, who found most human dramas mildly amusing, had a soft spot for his half-brother that he rarely admitted out loud. He had come now to escort Heracles through the parts of the Underworld where unguided mortals were liable to lose themselves forever. Hermes carried, as he always did, his strange double-headed staff called the caduceus, the staff of the messenger god, which had been entwined with two serpents since the beginning of time. He wore the winged sandals that allowed him to move freely between the worlds of the living, the dead, and the gods, the only being in the universe who held a permanent pass to all three. In the upper world he was a god of trade, travel and trickery, and his temples were popular with merchants and thieves alike. In this lower world he was something quieter, the steady, gentle hand on the elbow of every soul that had to make the crossing. The Greeks called this aspect of him Hermes Psychopompos, the soul guide, and they prayed to him at funerals more often than to Hades himself. He was, in his way, the most kindly figure in the entire Greek understanding of death. They walked together in companionable silence for a while. Hermes pointed out features of the landscape as they passed. The river Acheron with its mournful currents, the river Cocytus, where the truly grieving dead were said to gather, the vast plain where ordinary souls drifted in their dim eternal afternoon, the distant cliff where the most wicked of the dead were chained to various theatrical punishments, including Tantalus, who could never reach the fruit above him, and Sisyphus, who could never finish rolling his boulder up his hill. Heracles listened. He did not comment. The information was being filed away. He understood that he was being given a tour of a country that very few of his countrymen would ever see and live to describe, and he wanted to remember as much of it as possible. The crossing of the river Styx required a transaction. The ferryman, Charon, was an ancient and grim figure who carried souls across the dark water in his wooden boat. He demanded payment in the form of a coin, which was why Greek funerary traditions involved placing a coin in the mouth of the dead before burial. Heracles, who was very much alive, had no such coin. He also outweighed an ordinary soul considerably. Charon at first refused to take him. Hermes had a quiet word with the ferryman, explaining the situation. Eventually, with much grumbling about precedent, Charon agreed to ferry the living mortal across the river. He would later be punished by Hades himself for breaking the rule about the living, but that was a matter for after the visit was over. For now, Heracles climbed into the boat. The dark water lapped against its sides, and the three of them, hero, god, and ferryman, crossed into the deeper parts of the realm. It was in these deeper regions that Heracles encountered, for the first time, the dead he had personally known. The first one he saw, sitting alone on a low rock by the path, was a man named Meleager. Meleager had been one of the great heroes of an earlier generation, famous for organizing the legendary hunt for the monstrous Caledonian boar that had once devastated a kingdom called Caledon. Meleager and Heracles had never met in life. The Caledonian hunt had taken place before the labours began, and Meleager had died young, the victim of one of his own family's curses. But the two men had known of each other. Heroes of the Greek world existed in a kind of overlapping community, all of them aware of each other's reputations, all of them carrying the weight of similar burdens. Meleager looked up as Heracles approached. The shades of the dead were usually empty-eyed, but Meleager's eyes carried something more. He had not quite forgotten everything. He recognized the living man walking past him, and something like a smile crossed his pale face. He greeted Heracles by name. They stopped to speak. The conversation that followed was one of the most quietly important moments in all of the labours, and it would echo through the rest of Heracles' life in ways he could not yet imagine. Meleager told the hero about his own life, about the Caledonian hunt, about the family tragedies that had eventually brought him here. He spoke without bitterness. The dead, even those who remembered, did not seem to carry the weight of regret in the way the living did. Eventually Meleager mentioned his sister. Her name was Deianira. She had been a girl when he had died, and would now be a young woman of marriageable age. She lived back in Caledon with her father, the old King Aeneas. She was, by all reports, beautiful, intelligent, and strong-spirited. She had not yet been married, partly because her family was no longer as powerful as it had once been, and partly because the suitors who had come to ask for her hand were all, in her opinion, unworthy. Meleager, looking at Hercules, said something that the hero would later wish he had not heard. He told him that if any man deserved his sister's hand, it was the famous Hercules. He asked the hero, as one ghost might ask the living, to consider marrying Deianira when his labours were complete, to protect her, to give her the life she had not been able to have while her family's fortunes were declining. Hercules, who was standing in the kingdom of the dead, speaking with the ghost of a man he had never met in life, said yes. He did not say it lightly. He understood that a promise made in this place carried a weight that surface promises did not. He told Meleager that when his service to Eurystheus was finished, he would travel to Caledon, present himself to the old king, and ask for Deianira's hand. The ghost thanked him. Meleager's pale face relaxed into something close to peace. The conversation ended. Hercules continued on his way, with Hermes silent at his side. Hermes did not comment on what had just happened. He did not need to. The god of travellers had been present at countless promises over the centuries, and had developed a particular instinct for the ones that would end badly. He recognized one when he heard it. But it was not the place of a guide to interfere in mortal commitments, especially commitments made by his own half-brother, who had every right to choose his own future. The messenger god simply walked on. The pale shades of the dead drifted around them in the perpetual grey afternoon, and the only sound was the soft, dry whisper of feet on the ash-coloured ground. Neither of them mentioned at the time what that promise was going to cost. They continued deeper into the realm of the dead. As they approached the great central regions of Hades, where the gates and the palaces lay, Hercules saw another familiar figure, and this one was not a shade. He was alive. He was simply trapped. The man was Theseus, the same hero who had sailed with Hercules to the land of the Amazons during the 9th labour. Theseus had come down to the Underworld with a friend named Pirithous on a foolish mission. Pirithous had decided that he wanted to marry Persephone, the queen of the dead, and Theseus had agreed to help him. The two of them had descended into Hades, presented their case, and been welcomed politely by the lord of the Underworld himself. Hades had invited them to sit on great stone chairs while he considered their proposal. The moment the two heroes had taken their seats, the stone of the chairs had grown over them, fusing them to the rock. They had been stuck there ever since, alive but immobile, while Hades had quietly returned to his throne and forgotten about them. Hercules saw Theseus. He recognized him. He walked over to the chairs and stood looking at the two trapped men. Pirithous was unreachable. The deeper power of Hades had bound him to the stone, and even Hercules with all his strength could not break that binding. But Theseus was a different matter. The lord of the Underworld had been less personally offended by the Athenian hero, who had only come along as a friend rather than as the original instigator. Hercules took hold of Theseus by the arms and pulled. The stone resisted. He pulled harder. The chair began to crack. With one tremendous effort, the hero ripped Theseus free of the rock, leaving behind, according to some sources, a portion of the trapped man's flesh that would never grow back. Theseus would walk with a slight limp for the rest of his life. He would also, for the rest of his life, owe Hercules a debt that no friendship could ever quite repay. The story of the limp would become, in the Athenian tradition, a kind of national legend in itself. Theseus was the founder hero of Athens, the king who unified Attica and built the city into a great state. Athenian sculptors and painters depicting him in temples and on vases would sometimes include the slight unevenness in his stride that he had acquired in the underworld. It was a mark not of weakness, but of survival, the visible scar of a man who had been somewhere most mortals never returned from. The Athenians liked the detail. They liked that their founder king had a wound he wore with quiet pride, a wound that reminded everyone he was alive only because another hero had been willing to break stone with his bare hands to bring him back. It was, in its way, the foundation for the lifelong friendship between Athens and the cult of Hercules that endured for centuries afterward. Hercules set Theseus on his feet, told him to wait at the edge of the path, and continued forward to seek an audience with the king of the dead. The palace of Hades was not what Heracles had expected. He had imagined something grand and terrible, full of skulls and shadows. Instead, he found something closer to a quiet country estate. The palace was large but understated. The halls were dimly lit. The whole place had the feeling of an old library in the evening, full of the kind of silence that comes from rooms where serious work is being done by people who do not need to announce themselves. He was led to the throne room by silent attendants. There, on twin thrones of black stone, sat Hades and his queen Persephone. Hades was not the demonic figure of later medieval imagination. The Greek lord of the underworld was simply the brother of Zeus, the god who had drawn the worst lot when the three brothers divided the universe between them. Zeus had gotten the sky, Poseidon had gotten the sea, Hades had gotten the dead, which was a job no one had particularly wanted, and he had been doing it patiently for a very long time. He was dignified, fair, and slightly sad. Persephone, his queen, was younger, sharper-eyed, and watched the visitor with open curiosity. She spent half of every year above ground with her mother Demeter, and was rumoured to find her time in the underworld occasionally tedious. It is one of the strangest details of Greek mythology that the god most feared by mortals was, by all accounts, the most reasonable of the three brothers. Zeus was famous for his temper and his affairs. Poseidon was famous for his grudges and his earthquakes. Hades, by contrast, almost never interfered with the upper world at all. He had no temples in most Greek cities. He had no annual festivals. He had no priesthood agitating for political influence. He simply did his job in the quiet country below, organising the dead, hearing occasional petitions and avoiding unnecessary drama. The Greeks were terrified of his realm, not because he was cruel, but because he was inevitable. Everyone would eventually meet him. There was no negotiating with that fact. The fear was less about Hades himself than about the absolute certainty that he represented. Heracles bowed low. He explained his presence with the simple honesty that had served him with other gods before. He named his labour. He named the dog. He asked, with respect, for permission to take Cerberus to the surface and return him afterward. He did not threaten. He did not bargain. He simply asked. Hades looked at him for a long time. The lord of the underworld was not in the habit of granting favours to mortals, and the request was, by any standard, an extraordinary one. But Hades was also in his way a fair god. Heracles had been initiated at Eleusis. He had crossed the river by proper passage. He had asked respectfully. He had not even tried to bring weapons. The lord of the dead considered the matter carefully, exchanged a brief look with his queen, and then gave his answer. Heracles could take Cerberus to the surface. He could show the dog to Eurystheus, but the dog must be returned, and the hero must not use any weapon to subdue him. He must master Cerberus with his bare hands or not at all. If he failed, he would remain in the underworld permanently. There would be no second chance. Heracles thanked him. He bowed again to Persephone, who gave him a slight nod of approval, and he walked out of the palace toward the great gates where Cerberus stood guard. The dog of the underworld was the largest creature Heracles had ever seen. 3 heads, each the size of a horse, a serpent for a tail, a mane of writhing snakes around the central neck, 6 eyes that glowed with a dim red fire. The dog was vast, terrible, and ancient, the brother of the 2-headed Orthrus that Heracles had killed during the 10th labour, but larger by every measure. He was guarding the great gates as he had guarded them since the beginning of time, ensuring that no living thing entered the deeper realm and no dead thing escaped. He saw Heracles approaching, and all 3 heads began to growl. Heracles did not slow his pace. He walked directly up to the dog, opened his arms, and did the only thing that the conditions of his labour had left him to do. He wrestled the beast. What followed was the strangest fight of his entire career. The dog struck with 3 heads at once. Heracles ducked, dodged, and absorbed the impacts where he could not avoid them. The serpent tail lashed at him. The snake mane bit at his arms. He kept his grip on the central neck and pressed forward, refusing to let go, refusing to step back, refusing to give the dog any moment of leverage that might end the contest. He used the same technique that had once worked on the Nemean Lion in the very first labour, the technique of simply not letting go no matter what the animal did. The lion skin cloak protected him from most of the biting. His own immense strength gradually wore down the dog's resistance. By the time the fight ended, both combatants were exhausted. but only one of them was still standing. Cerberus, panting heavily, 3 tongues lolling from 3 different jaws, was finally still. There is, in this final wrestling match, a quiet symmetry that the older Greek storytellers loved to point out. The labours had begun with a wrestling match against a lion whose hide no weapon could pierce, won with bare hands. They were ending now with a wrestling match against a dog who guarded the gates of death, also won with bare hands. Between those 2 moments lay 12 years of monsters, kings, oceans, deserts, and divine interventions. But the bookends of the story were both, in their essential shape, the same. A man with no advantages except his own body, his own determination, and the simple refusal to release his grip. There was something almost philosophical about it. Hercules had been many things during his service. He had been a hunter, a sailor, an engineer, a tactician, a diplomat, a navigator of celestial mechanics. But at the beginning and at the end of his trials he had simply been a wrestler, the simplest of all warriors, the kind whose only weapon was the one nature had given him. Hercules loosened his grip carefully. He stroked the central head, the way one might soothe a frightened large dog. The animal, recognizing that it had been mastered, allowed the touch. There was no chain involved. There was no rope. Cerberus simply chose, in that moment, to follow the man who had wrestled him to a standstill. The hero turned, picked up Theseus from where he had been waiting, and began the long walk back through the underworld to the surface. The journey back was strangely peaceful. Hermes accompanied them part of the way. The shades they passed seemed this time to notice them, to look up briefly as the strange procession went by. A living man, an injured hero, a god, and a 3-headed dog who looked thoroughly embarrassed about the whole situation. Charon ferried them across the Styx again, this time without complaint. The long tunnel led upward through the cave at Tyneron, and eventually Heracles stepped out into the open air of the upper world, into a sunset he had not seen in months. The sky was orange and gold. The sea below the cliff was loud and bright. Cerberus, who had never seen the sun in his entire existence, shrank back against the rocks at the sudden brilliance of it. The dog began to drool a strange black foam, which according to the legend dripped onto the ground and became the first aconite, a poisonous flower that grows in shadowy places to this day. The walk from Tyneron back to Mycenae was, in many ways, the most awkward part of the entire labour. Heracles led Cerberus on what was essentially a long leash made of his own bare hand on the dog's central collar. The countryside they passed through, naturally, did not handle the sight well. Farmers fled, goats panicked, birds went silent. Several villages had to be detoured around entirely, because the people there had locked themselves into their homes and refused to come out until the strange procession had moved on. Heracles, who had grown used to causing this kind of reaction over the years, simply kept walking, occasionally murmuring to the dog to keep it calm. When they finally arrived at the gates of Mycenae, Eurystheus was alerted by the screams of his own city. He came running out of the palace, took one look at what was standing in his courtyard, and committed the most dramatic of all his many famous dives into his bronze jar. The lid slammed shut so quickly that one of his sandals was caught underneath it. From inside the jar, his muffled voice ordered Heracles to take the dog away immediately. Take it back. Take it anywhere. Just take it away from his kingdom. The labour was complete. The terms had been satisfied. The hero was for the first time in 12 years released from his service. There was a kind of cosmic comedy in the way the final labour ended. After 12 years of impossible tasks, after the slaughter of monsters and the crossing of oceans and the holding up of the sky itself, the great trial of Heracles concluded with a king hiding in a pot, shouting through bronze for the hero to please leave. No grand ceremony, no royal proclamation, no public gratitude or acknowledgement. The labours that would echo through 3,000 years of human storytelling, that would be carved into temple friezes and painted on red figure pottery, and quoted by Roman poets and rediscovered by Renaissance scholars, ended with their architect cowering inside a metal container. It was, you could argue, exactly the ending the relationship deserved. Eurystheus had spent 12 years pretending to be brave from the safety of his palace. Now, at the end, he was reduced to his most honest form, which was a frightened man yelling from inside a piece of kitchenware. Heracles stood for a long moment in the courtyard. He looked at the bronze jar. He looked at Cerberus, who was already eyeing the king's herald with the kind of curiosity that suggested he might have been considering breakfast. He looked at the palace of Mycenae itself, where he had reported every labour and received every disqualification, every taunt, every cruelty disguised as a royal command. He had been coming to this place for a decade. He had walked into this courtyard with the corpses of monsters, the skins of legendary beasts, the cattle of giants, the apples of the Hesperides. He had walked into it as a broken man and out of it as the greatest hero in the world. And now, finally, he would never need to walk into it again. He did not speak to the bronze jar. He did not bow. He simply turned, led Cerberus back the way they had come, and disappeared down the road toward the south. The dog would be returned to its post at the gates of the dead, where it would remain for the rest of eternity, presumably with a slightly chastened expression. Hercules himself would never return to Mycenae. The 10 years had stretched into 12. The 12 labours had been completed. The arithmetic was finally finished. He was by every count and every measure free. And yet, as he walked down the road in the long Greek twilight, there was a small piece of his mind that kept returning to the underworld and to the conversation with the ghost of Meleager. He had made a promise there. The promise had been about a woman named Deianira, in a kingdom called Calydon, far from anywhere he had been before. The labours were over. The service was complete. But the road ahead, the road of the rest of his life, was just beginning. And the very first step of it was going to be the journey to claim a bride, made on a vow given in the lightless country where vows weigh more than they ought to. He did not know yet what that promise would bring. He did not know yet that he had just sealed his own ending. The dog walked beside him for a few miles down the road, then turned obediently and began the long return journey to its post at the gates of Hades. Hercules watched it go. He stood for a long moment in the gathering dusk. Then he tightened the strap of his lion-skin cloak one more time, lifted his great olive-wood club to his shoulder, and turned west toward Calydon, toward the woman he had never met, toward the rest of his story. The world was wide now in a way it had not been wide before. The labours had been a kind of cage, a long obligation that had defined every step of his adult life. The cage was gone. The roads ahead of him led nowhere in particular, and everywhere all at once. He could have gone anywhere. He could have done anything. He could have settled down in some quiet village, picked up a craft, lived out his years as an ordinary man whose neighbours slowly forgot what he had once been. He did not do that. He went west, as promised. Whatever happened next would happen because of the promise made in the lightless country, not because the world was forcing him forward anymore. For the first time in 12 years, the choices were his own. That, in its way, was the heaviest weight he had carried since the labours began. The road to Calydon took Hercules north and west across the body of Greece, through olive groves and quiet farmlands that had not, for once, been laid waste by anything. He walked alone, without companions, without an army, without a mission from any king. It was a strange feeling. He had not walked anywhere without a purpose since he was a boy. The lion-skin cloak rested across his shoulders the same way it always had, and the great olive-wood club hung at his side, but the man underneath them was different now. He was, for the first time in his adult life, simply a traveller. Calydon was a smaller kingdom than Mycenae, tucked into the wooded country of central Greece. Its old king, Oeneus, had been a friend of the gods in his younger years, particularly Dionysus, who had at one point taught him how to make wine. The kingdom was past its glory days by the time Hercules arrived, but it still kept up the old customs of hospitality. The hero was welcomed at the palace gates, given a bath, fed, and seated in the place of honour at the king's table. He explained simply and without embellishment why he had come. He had made a promise in the underworld to Meleager, the king's late son. He had come to ask for the hand of Deianira. The detail about Dionysus teaching the king to make wine was, in the long Greek tradition, one of those quietly important pieces of information that explained more than it appeared to. Calydon was a wine-producing region. The king was on good terms with the gods of festivity and harvest. The household ran on a certain easygoing rhythm that had been shaped by decades of generous dinner tables and warm fires. It was not a place where a visitor was hurried, even a famous one. Hercules, who had spent years being measured by the impossibility of his next task, found the slower pace of the palace strangely soothing. He stayed several weeks before the question of marriage was formally raised. He spent the afternoons walking the orchards. He spent the evenings listening to the old king tell stories about gods he had personally met and meals he had personally cooked for them. It was, in a small way, the first ordinary stretch of life he had known since he was a boy. Aeneas listened carefully. He had heard the rumours of Hercules for years, of course. Every king in Greece had. The old man considered the proposal for a long evening, in the way old kings consider important things, while his daughter sat across the room observing the famous visitor with her own private thoughts about the matter. Deianira was, by every account, an unusual young woman. She was strong, calm, with a quiet intelligence that the king's other children had not inherited. She'd been raised to expect a difficult life, having watched her family's kingdom shrink during her childhood, and she had developed a kind of practical resilience that most princesses of her age had been spared. She was not, as the storytellers like to put it, an easily impressed person. She had also, as it turned out, been hearing about Hercules since she was a child, and she had her own opinion about whether the famous hero was likely to be a good husband. There was, however, one obstacle. Hercules was not the only suitor. There was another claimant for Deianira's hand, and he was not, strictly speaking, a person. He was a river god named Hercules, the lord of the largest river in Greece, who had been pressing his case at Aeneas's court for years. River gods, in the Greek imagination, were powerful and serious deities, and Hercules was the eldest and grandest of them all. He had a habit of appearing at the palace in different forms, sometimes as a man with a bull's head, sometimes as an enormous serpent, sometimes simply as a flow of water rolling through the throne room. Deianira had been politely terrified of him for several years, and her father, who did not want to anger a river god, had been unable to refuse the suit outright. When Heracles arrived, the situation became, by ancient royal standards, a competition. Aeneas declared that the two suitors would have to settle the matter themselves. Aeschylus, when summoned, was furious that a mortal would dare to challenge him. He arrived at the palace in his most impressive form, fully prepared to demonstrate that he was a far better match for the princess than some travelling hero who happened to have a famous reputation. The contest that followed was a wrestling match of all things, and like most of Heracles' defining moments, it turned on the simple refusal to let go. Hercules changed into a serpent. Heracles held on. Hercules changed into a bull. Heracles held on, and then, with a tremendous effort, broke off one of the bull's horns. The river god, defeated, surrendered the match. He retreated back into his river, leaving behind the broken horn which, according to some sources, was later filled with fruit and flowers by the local nymphs and became the very first cornucopia, the horn of plenty that has appeared in art and harvest decorations ever since. The most famous symbol of abundance in the ancient world, in other words, started its career as somebody's wrestling injury. Heracles married Deianira in a quiet ceremony at the palace of Calydon. There were no extravagant feasts, no months of celebration. Deianira had not wanted a grand wedding, and Heracles had no taste for one. They lived in the palace for a few years afterward, and during this time, the famous hero who had crossed the world and held up the sky discovered something he had not expected to discover. He was, against all probability, content. Deianira was an excellent companion. She was patient with his silences. She was uninterested in his fame. She asked him about his journeys, but did not ask him to perform them again as dinner-table stories. They had a son together, a boy named Hyllus, and Heracles relearned, slowly and carefully, what it felt like to hold a small hand in his own. He had been a father before. He had buried that part of himself. He was not entirely sure whether he was allowed to be a father again. But Deianira had her own quiet certainty about these things, and gradually, with her steady help, he began to live in the world again rather than walking through it. The household at Calydon developed a small set of routines, the kind of unremarkable daily structure that quietly defines a life. Heracles would rise before dawn, walk to the edge of the orchards, and watch the sun come up over the wooded hills. He would return to the palace for the morning meal and spend the rest of the day on whatever was needed, sometimes helping with the building of a new walls around the city, sometimes practicing weapons with the king's guards, sometimes simply sitting with Deianira in the courtyard while she worked at her loom. He had never owned a loom himself. He had never spent much time in a courtyard. He found, to his surprise, that he liked the soft, repetitive sound of the shuttle passing through the threads. He liked the way Deianira would occasionally look up and smile at him without saying anything. He liked, more than he could have articulated, the simple absence of urgent tasks. It was a life he would have laughed at 10 years earlier for being too small. He understood now that smallness was not the opposite of greatness. It was in some ways the reward for it. They might have stayed in Calydon forever, but fate in Greek mythology has a particular dislike for stillness. One afternoon, while at dinner with the king's household, Hercules accidentally killed a young servant boy who had been pouring water for him. It was, by all accounts, a moment of misjudged strength, the kind of accident that someone of his power could never quite escape. The boy slipped, the water spilled, and Hercules, irritated, struck him too hard on the head with a cuff that would have been gentle from anyone else. The boy died. The hero was devastated. Aeneas, despite his love for his son-in-law, was forced by his own laws of hospitality to demand that Hercules exile himself from Calydon as penance. The hero accepted the judgment without argument. He packed his small household, took Deianira and the young Hylas, and left the kingdom that had been his home. This is where the long, slow trap that had been set 13 years earlier finally began to close. The family of 3 made their way across the country toward a new home, a city called Trachis, where Hercules had old friends who would shelter them. Their road led them, on a particular afternoon, to a wide river called the Evenos, which was running high after spring rains and could not be safely crossed on foot. There was, however, a ferryman at the riverbank, a centaur who carried travellers across the deeper sections on his strong back. The centaur's name was Nessus. Nessus. The same centaur who had survived the long-ago disaster at the cave of Pholus, the one Hercules had unintentionally drawn into a fight during the fourth labour, the one who had escaped into the hills with a quiet vow of revenge, the one who had been waiting patiently for more than a decade. He recognised Hercules instantly when the family arrived at the riverbank, although he gave no sign of it. He offered, with great politeness, to ferry the woman and the child across first while Hercules followed on his own. The hero, who did not recognise Nessus and saw only a helpful ferryman, agreed to the arrangement. He handed Deianira up onto the centaur's back, watched her settle the boy against her chest, and turned to begin his own crossing through the river. The moment Hercules was waist-deep in the water, with his back to the opposite shore, Nessus took off at a gallop. He did not cross the river. He turned and ran along the bank, carrying Deianira away from her husband as fast as his 4 hooves could move. Hercules understood within seconds what was happening. He could not catch the centaur on foot. He pulled his bow from his shoulder, fitted one of his old hydra-poisoned arrows to the string, and fired across the water in a single fluid motion. The shot was perfect. It struck Nessus from a long distance away, the way only Hercules could shoot. The centaur fell. Deianira slid down from his back, unharmed but shaken. Hercules began wading furiously toward the far shore, but Nessus, lying on the riverbank with the poison already working its way through him, had time for one more move. He had planned this for 13 years. He was not going to die without using the plan. He turned to Deianira, who was kneeling beside him in shock. He spoke to her in a low, urgent voice. He told her that he was sorry for what he had tried to do. He told her that, as a final gesture of apology, he wanted to give her a gift. He pointed to the blood that was now seeping from his wound and told her, gravely and convincingly, that the blood of a centaur was a powerful love charm. If she ever feared that her husband's affections were straying, she should simply soak a piece of his clothing in it and let him wear it. The charm would draw his love back to her, infallibly, forever. The blood, he said, must be kept in a sealed flask, away from sunlight. She should never tell anyone about it. She should only use it if the worst came to the worst. Centaurs, in the older Greek imagination, were considered to have a particular knowledge of love potions and forest magic. They were known for their skill with herbs, with the deep knowledge of plants and roots that came from living half their lives as forest creatures. To a young woman raised on the same stories every Greek girl was raised on, the idea that a dying centaur might offer her a piece of folk magic as an apology was not, in itself, unreasonable. Nessus knew this. He had been counting on it. The genius of his trick was that it required Deianira to act on the very best impulses of a loyal wife. The poison would not be delivered by an enemy. It would be delivered by the hand of the woman who loved Hercules most. Vengeance could not be more carefully designed. Deianira, who was young, frightened, and had no reason to suspect a dying ferryman of a 13-year revenge plot, believed him. She collected some of the blood in a small flask from her travel bag. She sealed it. She hid it in her belongings. Nessus, satisfied that his vengeance had been planted in exactly the right place, allowed himself to die in peace. He had waited a long time, he had been very patient, and now, with a single careful lie, he had laid down a slow weapon that would do its work years from now, long after he was gone, in the hands of the very woman who loved his enemy most. Heracles reached the far shore moments later. He gathered his family. He did not ask Deianira what Nessus had said before dying. He assumed it was nothing important. They continued on to Trachis, the small flask of blood tucked away in a chest of personal belongings, and the trap was set. Years passed. Heracles, having settled in Trachis, returned to a quieter kind of life. He did not seek out adventures, but adventures as always found him. He helped his old friends settle a long-running dispute with a neighbouring kingdom. He led a small expedition against the city of Achalia, ruled by an old archery teacher of his, a king named Eurytus. There was history between Eurytus and Heracles, an old grievance about a contest that had ended badly years before, and the war was, by ancient standards, fairly typical. Heracles won the battle. He sacked the city. And in the customary fashion of ancient victors, he took the surviving members of the royal family back to Trachis as captives, including a princess named Iole, who was the daughter of the defeated king. This is where the trap began to spring. Iole was young and beautiful, and Heracles had once, many years before, asked for her hand in marriage and been refused by her father in the contest that had started their old feud. The captives were brought back to Trachis. Heracles sent word ahead to Deianira to prepare for his return. He also sent, in the manner of ancient warriors returning from war, a request that his wife send him a fresh tunic for the great victory sacrifice he was planning to perform to Zeus on his return. When Deianira saw Iole among the captives being brought back to her household, she made a quiet, terrible assumption. She did not ask Heracles about the princess. She did not voice her fears. She simply remembered, after all these years, the dying words of the centaur Nessus by the river. She remembered the small sealed flask. She went to the chest in which she had stored her old belongings, retrieved the flask, and quietly, while her household servants were preparing the celebratory tunic, she anointed the garment with the centaur's blood. She did it carefully, soaking the inner fabric, and then she dried the tunic in a shaded corner of the house, where the sunlight could not touch it. She folded it neatly. She sent it off to Heracles with a household servant named Lycus, telling the servant only that this was the tunic for the sacrifice. She kept her own counsel about everything else. She believed she was doing what was necessary to keep her husband. She believed the blood of Nessus was a love charm. She had no idea what was really inside the flask. It is one of the saddest threads in the entire saga, made more painful by how reasonable Deianira's actions seem when traced step by step. She had not been jealous in the petty sense. She had been frightened in the deep, quiet way that long marriages can sometimes be frightened, the kind of fear that does not announce itself but settles slowly into the corners of a home. She had watched her husband leave on a war. She had heard the rumours of who had come back with him. She had remembered a gift given to her in a desperate moment 13 years before, the kind of gift that one accepts and then half forgets, but never quite forgets enough to throw away. She had used it the only way she knew how. Greek tragedy, when it works properly, is rarely about villains. It is most often about people doing what seems sensible in the moment, with terrible consequences they cannot foresee. Deianira's mistake belonged to that family of tragedies. She had only ever wanted to keep her husband. She did not know that the dying creature who had given her the flask had counted on exactly that wish. Heracles received the tunic at the place where he had set up his sacrificial altar, on a hillside near the sea. The weather was warm, the sun was bright. He bathed, dressed himself in the fresh white tunic his wife had sent, and began the sacrifice to his father Zeus. The first sign that something was wrong came almost immediately. As the heat of the sacrificial fire began to rise, the fabric of the tunic began to change. The poison that had been soaking into the cloth, dormant since the day Nessus had bled, was activated by warmth. It began to burn, not in the way a flame burns. In a deeper, more terrible way, the way the Hydra's venom had always done its work. The hero understood within seconds what was happening. He tried to tear the tunic from his body. He could not. The poisoned fabric had bonded to his skin, fused to it the way nothing should ever fuse to living flesh. Every attempt to pull it free took skin with it. The pain was, by his own later admission, beyond anything he had ever experienced in the long catalogue of his sufferings, worse than the weight of the sky on the western edge of the world, worse than any wound any monster had ever given him. The greatest mortal who had ever lived had finally met something his strength could not solve. There was no enemy here to wrestle. There was no clever trick to be tried. The thing that was killing him was woven into the cloth that touched him. Likas, the household servant who had delivered the garment, had been waiting nearby to bring word of the sacrifice home. He saw what was happening and panicked. Hercules, in his agony, lashed out and struck him too hard, and the servant did not survive the blow. The hero would later mourn this. He would mourn many things. But in the immediate moment, all he could think of was that he was dying, and that something terrible had been done to him, and that he needed to understand what. He sent another messenger, a young man named Hylas, who happened to be his own son, back to Trachis with a single question. Where had the tunic come from? Hylas rode home as fast as he could. He found his mother in the household. He told her gently that something terrible had happened. He asked her about the tunic. Deianira, hearing the news, finally understood what she had done. The young woman who had collected the centaur's blood at the riverbank had not been malicious. She had been frightened. She had been 20 years old and afraid of losing her husband, and she had trusted a dying creature she had no reason to suspect. The flask had not contained a love charm. The flask had contained the slow revenge of an enemy Hercules had not even remembered. She had been a pawn in a game whose rules she did not know. The legends do not agree on exactly what happened to Deianira after she understood. Some sources say she took her own life. Others say she lived out the rest of her days in silent grief in the household, never speaking of what she had done, never quite recovering from the knowledge of it. Either way, her story effectively ended at that moment. She had been an instrument in a scheme she had not designed, used against a man she loved, by an enemy who had died years before. There was no monster to blame. There was no battle to fight. There was only the cruel, slow arithmetic of an old grievance reaching its conclusion. Heracles, meanwhile, having been carried by his companions to the slopes of Mount Oeta, made one final decision. He understood now that he could not be cured. He understood that the poison would not stop. The Hydra's venom had finally come home, just as he had always suspected somewhere deep in the back of his mind that it eventually would. The blood he had dipped his arrows in during the second labour, in a young man's careful preparation for the trials ahead, had been waiting for him this whole time. He gathered his strength. He climbed to the top of the mountain. He had his attendants build him a great pyre out of oak logs, the way the ancient Greeks built funeral pyres for their honoured dead. He arranged the wood himself when he could. He lay down upon the finished pyre, placed his great olive-wood club beside him, draped the lion-skin cloak over his body one last time, and asked the people gathered around him to set the wood on fire. No one would do it. His companions wept. His son refused. The whole hillside stood silent, unwilling to be the one to light the pyre of the greatest hero who had ever lived. Eventually a young friend of his named Philoctetes, an archer with a quiet face and a steady hand, stepped forward and agreed to perform the task. In return, Heracles gave him his own legendary bow and his quiver of Hydra-poisoned arrows. The bow that had killed the Stymphalian birds, the bow that had wounded Geryon, the bow that had freed Prometheus from the eagle, was passed in this last moment to a younger man who would carry it into a future of his own. Philoctetes would later use it in the Trojan War, where the prophecy said that Troy could not fall without this very bow being present. Even now, at the end, Heracles was setting in motion the events of stories still to come. Philoctetes took a torch. He lowered it slowly to the dry oak. The fire caught. The pyre began to burn. What happened next is the moment that turned the entire saga of Heracles from a story about a hero into a story about something larger. As the flames rose around him, the mortal portion of him, the part inherited from his human mother Alcmena, was consumed in the fire. But the divine portion, the part inherited from Zeus himself, was not. The fire could not burn what was already immortal. As the smoke rose from the pyre, a great cloud descended from the sky, summoned by Zeus himself, and from within the cloud the divine part of Heracles rose upward, leaving the mortal ashes behind. Athena and Hermes were said to have come for him personally, escorting him through the clouds the way they had once accompanied him in his earlier trials. He rose past the level of the eagles. He rose past the level of the clouds. He rose finally to the high peaks of Mount Olympus itself, where the gods received him at their gates. It is worth pausing on the strangeness of this ending, because it is one of the most unusual moments in all of ancient mythology. Heracles is, by most counts, the only mortal in the entire Greek tradition who becomes a full Olympian god by virtue of his own life rather than by birth. Other heroes received various honours after their deaths. Some became minor deities of small regions, some became patron spirits of cities or trades, but none of them ascended fully to Olympus. Only Hercules did that. The gods accepted him as one of their own, not because he was born to it, but because he had earned it through suffering that no other being, mortal or divine, had ever quite matched. The Greeks took this idea very seriously. They worshipped Hercules in two distinct ways for the rest of their civilization, once as a great hero whose tomb shrines could be visited on earth, and once as a god whose temples could be approached for prayers about strength, endurance, or the bearing of difficult things. He was the only figure who occupied both categories at once. His story, in the end, was not just about heroism. It was about the strange grace by which a life of constant trial could be transformed into something that the gods themselves had to acknowledge. The reconciliation that followed was one of the strangest moments in all of Greek mythology. Hera, the goddess who had hated Heracles since before his birth, the one who had sent the serpents to his cradle, and the madness to his home and the lies to the Amazons, was waiting at the gates of Olympus. By the older laws of the gods, she could have refused to accept him. She could have demanded that Zeus reject this last son of his many infidelities. She did not. Whether she had finally exhausted her hatred, or whether she had been impressed despite herself by the sheer endurance of the man she had been trying to destroy, the goddess opened her arms to him at the gates of heaven. In some versions of the myth, she even gave him her own daughter Hebe, the goddess of eternal youth, as his immortal wife. The old enemies became, by the strange logic of myth, family at last. Heracles took his place among the gods. The lion-skin cloak became his constellation, set in the sky as one of the great patterns of stars that still bears his name. The club rested beside him. The labours were over. The promise made to the ghost of Meleager had been kept, and had cost him everything he had left to give. But the man who had walked through every kind of suffering had walked through this last one as well, and had come out the other side as something more than mortal. The story endures because of what it carries underneath the spectacle. The lion killing and the river bending and the wrestling with titans are the parts that get painted onto vases and carved into temples. But the deeper thread is the one about a man who lost his family early, who carried grief through 12 years of unfair punishment, who learned to use cleverness alongside strength, who built cities and freed prisoners and helped strangers along his road, who loved a woman quietly in a peaceful house in Caledon, who was undone in the end by a kindness that turned into a poison. He was not a perfect hero. He made terrible mistakes, sometimes by accident and sometimes by anger, and the price of those mistakes was paid by people who did not deserve to pay it. But he kept walking. He kept choosing to walk, and when his strength failed him at the very last, he had the courage to climb onto the pyre himself, to give away his bow to a younger friend, and to release the world he had spent his whole life trying to make a little less monstrous. The constellation Hercules, named for him by the later Romans, can still be seen on summer nights in the northern sky. It is not the brightest pattern. It does not have any especially famous stars. It sits, modestly, between the constellations Lyra and Corona Borealis, a kneeling figure with one arm raised. Most people who look up at it do not know the name. Some who do know the name do not remember the story, but the stars, in their patient way, do not mind being forgotten by individual generations. They keep their shape, they keep their position, they wait, the way the dead in the underworld waited for someone passing through to glance up and remember. And there it is, the whole tale, from the first labour to the final fire. 12 impossible tasks, one impossibly resilient man, a goddess who could not quite finish what she started, and a hero who never quite stopped walking forward. He earned his place among the stars the hard way, one task at a time, one mistake at a time, one quiet act of kindness or stubborn endurance at a time. He was, in the end, what everyone who tells his story has always known he was. The greatest mortal who ever lived, because he refused to be defeated by being mortal. That is where we leave him tonight, up among the constellations, his lion-skin cloak still draped across his shoulders, his club resting beside him, the long road behind him at last. Thank you for travelling along this story with me, all the way from the cradle in Thebes to the pyre on Mount Oeta to the high gates of Olympus. I hope it has carried you through a quiet, gentle evening. Now turn down those lights, settle back into your blankets, and let your mind drift the way the great hero finally got to drift, free of his labours at last. Good night, friends, wherever you may be tuning in from. Sweet dreams, and may the stars watch over you until the morning.